So we have a new video up for people who are supporters of the Thom Hartmann Program. Specifically, it's over at thomhartmann.com, talking about language, how we use language. Language matters tremendously. And we have chosen as a society, as a culture, as media, as political leadership, et cetera, not to refer to people like Steve Mnuchin, who threw thousands of people out of their homes illegally during the banking crisis, as looters, not to refer to Rex Tillerson, whose oil company has ravaged much of the third world, literally destroying people's lives, killing people, poisoning people. We don't refer to them as looters. We don't refer to the police who go into neighborhoods and kill people, minorities, particularly African Americans. We don't refer to them as looters, stealing their lives. But when black people rise up and say, no, enough, we call them looters. There's something wrong with this. Check it out. It's at thomhartmann.com.
Our book in today's Thom Hartmann Book Club is by Harvey J. Kaye, Professor Harvey Kaye. Take Hold of Our History, Make America Radical Again. This is from the introduction. On December 1st, 1862, in the midst of the Civil War, just weeks before he was to issue the Emancipation Proclamation, President Abraham Lincoln delivered his annual message to Congress. Lincoln firmly believed that the United States had an historic responsibility to demonstrate to the world that people can govern themselves, make equal rights not just a self-evident truth, but a manifest one, and create a political and economic order in which working people, both white and black, are not compelled to bow to anyone, neither aristocrats nor capitalists. Empowered by tens of thousands of black slaves who were already liberating themselves from bondage by escaping to the Union lines, and increasingly confident that the majority of his fellow Americans would recognize the truth of what he was saying, Lincoln closed his address by calling on them to see that the time had come to remember who they were and what they demanded, or what that demanded. He told them that to save the nation and all that it represented, they must live up to the nation's declared revolutionary purpose and promise, and act to radically enhance American freedom by bringing an end to slavery. This is a quote from Lincoln's address. Fellow citizens, we cannot escape history. The fiery trial through which we pass will light us down in honor or dishonor to the latest generation. We say we are for the Union. The world will not forget that we say this. We know how to save the Union. The world knows we do know how to save it. We, even we here, hold the power and bear the responsibility. In giving freedom to the slave, we assure freedom to the free, honorable alike in what we give and what we preserve. We shall nobly save or meanly lose the last best hope of earth. We too, end of quote from Lincoln, back to Harvey. We too cannot escape history. Our own struggle to save the nation and the promise it proclaims has begun. Finally, after more than 40 years of fear-driven class war and culture war campaigns against the democratic achievements of generations, the hard-won rights of workers, women and people of color, and the very memory of how they were secured, and now both in the wake of the election debacle of 2016, which gave the presidency to the corrupt, mendacious, racist, sexist, and treacherous demagogue Donald Trump, and continued control of Congress to the formerly conservative but increasingly reactionary Republican Party, and in the face of intensified class and culture war campaigns, we the people have come not only to recognize that American democratic life is in jeopardy, but also to mobilize in hopes of saving it. Millions of us have rallied to the resistance and expressed our democratic fears and desires in action. In the historic Women's March and March for Our Lives of young people, the protests, demonstrations, and legal actions to defend the lives and rights of immigrants and refugees, the Me Too movement to combat sexual assault and harassment, the massive teachers' strikes for higher pay and better funding of public schools in states red and blue, and the enthusiastic canvassing and campaigning for a blue wave to win back Congress in the 2018 midterm elections. But resistance is not enough. The time has come for us to remember who we are and what that demands. The time has come for us to embrace our radical history. the history of how a generation of Americans, high and low, and in all their diversity, not only turned their colonial rebellion into a war for independence, but also imbued American life, whether they all intended it or not, with radical imperative and impulse by declaring a revolutionary promise of freedom, equality, and democracy for all. The history of how generations of radicals and reformers served as the prophetic memory of that promise, and how generations of ordinary men and women, native-born and immigrant, struggled to make real the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, and to expand not only the we in We the People, but also the powers of the people. And most especially in view of the crises we ourselves face, the history of how our greatest generations confronted and prevailed over the forces that threatened to destroy the nation and bury its revolutionary promise in the 1770s, 1860s, and 1930s and 1940s, not to mention the 1960s, by acting to make the United States, both inspired by Washington, Lincoln, and FDR, and pushing them to go farther than they might otherwise have gone, radically freer, more equal, and more democratic than ever before. The time has come to take hold of that history and make America radical again. I've titled this collection of my speeches and essays, Take Hold of Our History, Make America Radical Again, for reasons that will become obvious, and yet I cannot help but confess that if I had had to title it otherwise, I would have been sorely tempted to use, with full attribution, the title Max Lerner gave to his 1938 work, It Is Later Than You Think, The Need for a Militant Democracy. While it may not seem so, the crisis we face is no less demanding of action, urgent action, than that which confronted his generation. The book Take Hold of Our History by Harvey J. Kaye.
This is the Thom Hartmann Program.
Well, happy Wednesday. Congressman Pocan was with us yesterday, so today is not middays with Mark. It's middays with me. It's Thom Hartmann here with you. And boy, so much going on right now with regard to Bill Barr. You have this ultra-Trumpy judge, Naomi Rao, R-A-O, I'm assuming it's pronounced Rao, who she was a Trump appointee, in fact, a recent Trump appointee, along with a George Bush appointee, over the objections of a Barack Obama appointee. This is a three-judge panel in the D.C. Circuit, saying that, if Bill Barr does not want to prosecute Michael Flynn, even though he clearly committed crimes, in fact, arguably, according to Judge Sullivan, committed treason, sold out his country, that's Bill Barr's prerogative. The courts don't have to hear the case if he chooses not to bring it. And, the courts can't second guess the prosecutor. Now, there's a certain kind of twisted internal logic to that. But, where this goes next is going to be very, very interesting. In all probability, it'll go to I believe it's 11 members of the D.C. Circuit Court. This was just a three-judge panel. And all 11 judges will decide whether that's the case. And then the Supreme Court can choose to either leave that intact or pick it up. But I'm guessing this is not the end of this. At the same time, we have two prosecutors from the Department of Justice preparing to testify before Congress in the next few hours. This is truly mind-boggling. That they were, one of them saying that they were told to go easy on Roger Stone. Now, that was Michael Flynn we were talking about just a minute ago. Michael Flynn, who was being paid $500,000 by the government of Turkey to alter U.S. positions with regard to Turkey. Keep in mind, Jeffrey Berman, the SNDY Southern District of New York prosecutor who was just fired by Bill Barr, was looking into this bank, this Turkish bank, that Donald Trump, according to John Bolton's book, had told President Erdogan of Turkey, I'll get rid of that prosecution once I get rid of Obama's people and put my people into the Southern District of New York. He explicitly said that, according to Bolton's book. So you had Mike Flynn, who was working for Turkey, who was being paid by Erdogan at the same time that he was Trump's national security advisor, which, of course, is a crime. It's a felony. So you've got that case. That's the one that, you know, these two Republican appointees. By the way, this is why Mitch McConnell has been on a screaming tear to put as many of these young right-wing lawyers, many of them with no trial experience whatsoever, many of them never even argued a case in a courtroom, on the federal bench with lifetime judicial appointments, so that they can do the bidding of the oligarchs who own Mitch McConnell, and of which Donald Trump is one. So anyhow, that's the Mike Flynn situation. Then with Roger Stone, you've got Aaron Zelinsky, who was a U.S. attorney, who was a prosecutor in the DOJ. And John Elias is also going to testify today. Zelinsky is going to testify that the people in his office, his supervisors, and the big question is whether he will name his supervisors at the Department of Justice, were, quote, afraid of Trump. Actually, the quote was afraid of the president. I'm reluctant to refer to him that way because I don't consider him my president. He did not win a majority of votes and he has not behaved like a president. But in any case, so you've got Zelinsky, who is going to be saying, and it isn't ironic, he sort of shares a last name with the Ukrainian president. He is going to be saying, we went easy on Roger Stone, the old Nixon operative, who is now the Trump operative, who it turns out, now that we've seen the unredacted portions of the Mueller report, Roger Stone was the connection between the Russian oligarchs who handled the hacking of Hillary Clinton's emails and handed them off to WikiLeaks, between those folks, the WikiLeaks Russian folks, and Donald Trump himself personally. Roger Stone is the one who could put Trump in prison, who demonstrates that Trump committed treason. So Trump, at the very least, is probably terrified of Roger Stone. So Trump is saying, go easy on Roger Stone, and these guys are like, well, this prosecutor, Zelinsky, is saying, well, here's what he said in his prepared remarks. He says, quote, I was also told that the acting U.S. attorney was giving Stone such unprecedentedly favorable treatment because he was afraid of the president. We were told by a supervisor that the U.S. attorney had political reasons for his instructions, which our supervisor agreed was unethical and wrong. However, we were instructed that we should go along with the U.S. attorney's instructions because this is, quote, not the hill worth dying on, and that we could, quote, lose our jobs if we did not toe the line. And this all followed a 3 a.m. tweet by Donald Trump saying that the proposed, I believe it was 8 years in prison for Roger Stone, was he says, we cannot allow this miscarriage of justice. And hours later, senior Justice Department officials were saying, okay, we are dancing to the tune of Donald Trump. My words, not theirs. Zelinsky and 3 other colleagues withdrew themselves from the Stone case. One of them, Jonathan Kravis, actually left the Department of Justice. And the guy who filed new sentencing recommendations, who did Bill Barr's dirty work, who did Donald Trump's dirty work on behalf of Roger Stone, was U.S. Attorney Timothy Shea, just for the record. The other guy who's going to testify, Mr. Elias, is going to testify, John Elias is going to testify that Bill Barr told him to go hard on car companies that were going along with California's emission rules. That part of it is getting almost no publicity. This is obviously in behalf of the fossil fuel billionaires. And then also to trash the marijuana, the legal marijuana industry, by subpoenaing them and forcing them to spend hundreds of thousands of dollars on legal fees to produce millions of documents. You know, in my opinion, impeaching Barr won't just protect us from corrupt senior law enforcement officials. It'll also strengthen our protection against this dangerous autocrat, Donald Trump. Trump famously said, "Where's my Roy Cohn?" Well, he's got him in Bill Barr. And as we head toward the November election and then the January 20th installation of hopefully a new president, Donald Trump becomes more dangerous by the day. He has learned how to use the levers of power in the White House. He's applying them in increasingly appalling ways and corrupt ways. He's transferred over $2 trillion of your and my tax money to himself and his corrupt oligarch billionaire friends. He's corrupting the flow of money in our country. He's also corrupted the flow of justice, of criminal justice in our system. Bill Barr should certainly be impeached and then prosecuted for the very clear crimes he's committed while in office. But more important, he needs to be impeached as soon as possible to remove from Donald Trump the power to, quote, help my friends and punish my enemies, a power that's the hallmark of a dictator. Impeaching Bill Barr is an absolutely essential step to saving our republic and restoring American democracy. You can find that rant over, by the way, over at buzzflash.com. But that's what's going on right now. In the next segment, I want to get into this question of who's right about freedom, Republicans or Americans, and tell you what happened at Trump's Youth for Trump, or whatever it was, so-called rally. Well, it was a rally yesterday in Arizona. It was bizarre.
This is the Thom Hartmann Program.
We'll be back with more in just a moment. Stick around. So just to amplify this point, this is in the Michael Flynn case, where the, quote, ultra-Trumpy judge, Naomi Rao, basically said, no, you got to let Mike Flynn go. Right now. Let him go. I mean, he's not in custody anyway, but hey, let's let him go. Now, remember when the Never Trump legal conservatives were saying, now this is like, you know, the Bill Kristol crowd, right? The Never Trump conservatives who show up, you know, like David Jolly, who show up on MSNBC and trash Donald Trump. But then say, oh, isn't it wonderful, all these conservative judges being put in lifetime appointments. Mark Joseph Stern tweets, the Never Trump conservatives said, quote, you can oppose Trump and still support Trump's judicial nominees because Leonard Leo, he's the head of the legal society, the Federalist Society that through the ranks of which come these young conservatives when they've been blessed by, the Kochs and whatnot. You can oppose Trump and still support Trump's judicial nominees because Leonard Leo selected the finest, most independent legal minds of the nation who are sure to act as a check on this administration. Right. She actually, Naomi Rao, this super Trumpy judge who's only been on the court a short while. She's one of the more recent appointees. She didn't even say, we're saying let Mike Flynn go because of the law. She instead invented this thing. She said that Judge Sullivan, the guy who, the judge who said, wait a minute, we're not going to let you drop this case, Bill Barr, he's already pled guilty or pleaded guilty. If he has already pleaded guilty, we have to proceed with sentencing. You can't just undo that. You can't unring that bell. It's already happened in court, in front of this court, in front of me as a judge. You can't undo that. And she made no legal argument about that. Instead, she said that that what that constituted was, quote, unprecedented intrusions on individual liberty. And asked, that it or asserted that it was absolutely wrong that Judge Solomon, quote, dared to probe the government's motives. Mark Joseph Stern goes on to say, I don't see why the D.C. Circuit Court can't take this case en banc to reverse route. That's all 11. But I need a civil procedure person to tell me if there are different en banc rules for mandamus petitions. This was filed as a writ of mandamus, which is like, urgent, do this, in the courts. He goes on to say, I would expect to see a move to en banc, having all active judges hear the case. Oh, that was Joyce Vance, who said that this is, a clear case of bad faith by the DOJ. And went on to say, I fully expect the D.C. Circuit to step in and correct this mistake. This is Christina Farias. And then for the Supreme Court to leave this case alone. We'll see. How badly corrupted has our political system become? Our 1 hour free podcast recaps our show, and it's available wherever fine podcasts are found. And we have the full 3 hour podcast available over at thomhartmann.com if you want to really support our program. In our special video for supporters of our program, people who sign up over at thomhartmann.com, this week it's the story of what the rich libertarian billionaires who have been funding the Libertarian Party and the Republican Party for, in a big way since the election of Ronald Reagan for the last 40 years, and have succeeded by owning politicians and owning the Republican Party in preventing us from even getting a public option, much less a national health care system. What they are doing, what their answer is, what their response is to the question, what do we do when things really go bad? When the economy's falling apart, when epidemic disease is sweeping the country, what do we do? Well, it turns out they've got an answer. It's just not an answer for all the rest of us. They're getting in their private jets and heading off to their private little bunkers. Seriously, that's what they're up to. So I lay out the whole story, complete with details and names, over at thomhartmann.com. Check it out. Thanks so much. Back, Thom Hartmann here with you. So this is what happened yesterday at this Young People for Trump rally. He called Democrats intolerant and totalitarian. He said that students who, quote, stand up for America and refuse to kneel to the radical left are good, and that the mainstream media and, quote, vicious Democrats are stifling dissent. And Democrats want to let anyone vote, quote, even if they're not citizens. Another blatant lie. He told these young people in the audience, you guys are smarter than Democrats. The Democrats want absolute conformity. Now just think about this. You're a young person, and the President of the United States, the most powerful person in the world, at least theoretically, at least up until the last few years, comes to your town and says to you, a young person, an impressionable young person, quote, Democrats hate our history. They hate our values. They hate everything we prize as Americans. Now, what would you think about the Democratic Party? Which he won't even use its proper name, the Democratic Party. He calls it the Democrat Party. There's no such thing as a Democrat Party. He goes on to say, our country didn't grow great with them, Democrats. It grew great with you and your thought processes and your ideology. The left-wing mob is trying to demolish our heritage so they can replace it with a new oppressive regime that they alone control. When he mentioned the coronavirus, he called it the plague. He said, it's going away. Not to worry. It's going away. He said, what a great job we did with testing. We did ventilators. We're going to have a vaccine very soon. I guarantee you that's going to be his October surprise. He thinks that's going to get him elected. But about the virus, he says, people get sick from the other. Not just the virus. People get sick from all the other things that happen. You know what I mean. We got to open up. And then he called it, several different racist names. A spokesman for Donald Trump's campaign recently said on CNN that they don't require people to wear face masks at Trump events because freedom. Franklin Roosevelt back in 1936, actually, I think. Or not, yeah, it was 33. It was in his inaugural address, said, "A necessitous man is not a free man." If you're hooked up to a ventilator and can't breathe, you're not free. If you're sick and can't afford to pay for health care, you're not free. If you're hungry and can't buy food for your family, you're not free. If your landlord has thrown you out in the street because you lost your job because of a virus and you can't pay your rent, you're not free. If you're afraid to hang out with your own family because you don't want to die from coronavirus and your government is refusing to do comprehensive testing and contact tracing, you're not free. The majority of Americans, virtually every poll shows, want to join the truly free advanced democracies of the world. They want a national health care program so nobody will go bankrupt because they got sick. They want free education through college and quality primary schools so every young person's full potential can be developed. They want food and housing to be rights, not privileges, as Franklin Roosevelt proposed in his second Bill of Rights back in 1944. But Republicans have told us that freedom means the right to die in debt, the freedom to remain uneducated, the freedom to be hungry and homeless. They argued that freedom means the right of a small number of rich people to suck up all the assets and resources of society, leaving almost nothing for the working class. They say the real meaning of freedom is more tax cuts for billionaires and more poison and pollution in our air and water from industry. That's freedom. It's time to take that word back, right? At the very least, it's time to take that word back. But this is what these guys are up to. They're using voter suppression because they don't want people to vote. By the way, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez won her primary by 50 points. Eliot Engel lost his primary by a substantial margin. He's the kind of Republican Democrat. This was a primary. He got replaced by a real Democrat. I mean, these are good signs, but look at what Mitch McConnell's doing with the judiciary. And this is what we're seeing played out. It's going to be played out before Congress in testimony today. And it's being played out right now in the Southern District of New York. You're seeing this in the D.C. case of Michael Flynn. You're seeing this in the New York case of Roger Stone. The buddies of Donald Trump. This is how autocrats and oligarchs work. This is not how representative democratic republics work. Our republic, it has been shaken to its core by this man and by this movement, this so-called conservative movement, funded largely with fossil fuel dollars. Oh, and in the next hour, I'm going to tell you about what Facebook is up to with fossil fuel denial. It's amazing.
You're listening to the Thom Hartmann Program. Call 202-808-9925.
In fact, in our next hour, Professor Jeffrey D. Sachs will be with us. And in our third hour, Danielle Melgar from the U.S. Public Interest Research Group is going to be here about toxics in our environment.
Our book today in the Thom Hartmann Book Club is Health Justice Now, Single Payer and What Comes Next by Timothy Faust. And this is from the introduction. A secret scream rings through America. It rings down the sterile fluorescent hallways of our hospitals. It rings over our rural towns and our native reservations. It rings through our prisons, the bellies of our great cities. It rings in our farms and our fields, our streets and our sewers, our bodies and our blood. And we are cursed to never hear it clearly until at last we realize it has been our own mouth screaming and we are lost. A child born today inherits in that secret a new American squalor, the skeletal remains of the American cities, the bleached bones of the American suburbs. This secret is a birthright of continual exploitation, pumped for labor and drained of cash and then punished for the resulting suffering. Punished for being hungry, punished for being sick, punished for being pregnant, punished for being poor, punished for being black or brown, punished for being queer, for being unlucky, for being. At the base of that suffering is lodged a little truth, like a knot in the stomach. In America, sickness makes you poor, and poorness makes you sick. This is a book about that relationship and why it happens, and why it's unnecessary, and what we can do to fix it. The cosmic whirling of God's great slot machine has not determined that some people are fated to suffer while others flourish. We have the resources to take care of everyone, and yet we refuse to do so. Your medical debt and medical bills are unnecessary, but we have chosen to make them necessary. These are structural problems with structural causes, and many of them share roots in how we pay for health care. This is a book about health care and health finance. They are different. Health care is anything that helps you stay safe and healthy. It's a kind of freedom from and within your own body. Health finance is the method by which we as a country pay for that freedom and by which we decide who gets to have it and who doesn't. Health care is more than what happens to you in the hospital. Health care is whether your home makes you sick, or your food makes you sick, or your environment makes you sick, or whether you have enough money to afford the things that keep you healthy. In America, the structure of corporate health care has convinced us that some people deserve health care and some people don't. This is a book about that corporate health finance, about private insurance and private insurers. For half a century, they've convinced us that they're the only things that keep us or could ever keep us from the utter financial ruination of illness. They've sold us different inadequate insurance plans and persuaded us that this is a form of great liberty, while chipping away at our freedoms for profit and holding our bodies and our children's bodies hostage. This is a book about single-payer health care, a health finance model in which we pool our abundant collective resources to provide health care to all people. It is a common model across the world. As we will discuss in this book, we have the potential not just to enact a single-payer program in America, but to build the greatest health care program among any so-called developed democracy. Here is my profession of faith. I believe beyond any doubt that single-payer is demonstrably sound and imminently feasible. I believe a properly ambitious and well-structured single-payer program will do more than any other American social program of this generation to soothe the burns, to resuscitate the spirit, to nourish the moral will of the American people. I believe it will loosen the loathsome manacles of American health finance, an exploitative institution that profits by plundering from us our own bodily autonomy, and that anchors a larger exploitation that holds those whom we love as captive leverage to guarantee our servitude to abusive employers or domestic partners, to those who seek to dominate us both in the office and in the hospital. I believe this nation owes its people, whose labor has created its rich banquet, the safety and agency of health care. I believe this health care is greater in scope than that which happens upon an operating table. I believe that housing, food, income, and more, the components of basic human dignity, are health care. And I believe our work is that of striving toward justice for all people. And I therefore believe, I have to believe, that single-payer health care is our moral imperative. Single-payer is our tool. Single-payer is our weapon. Single-payer is our first step. But single-payer on its own is not the goal. This book is about health justice. Healthcare is personal, so I want to start this book personally by introducing two friends of mine, Steve Way and Kyle Kolick. They're two guys about my age, I'm 30, who live in North New Jersey. They're sweet, gentle people and probably the most charismatic pair of friends I've met in my entire life. They make me laugh until my face hurts, and we like watching pro wrestling together. They're also being utterly broken by our American healthcare system, and it's keeping them from living their lives. Steve has muscular dystrophy. The muscle and tissues that hold his body together are eating themselves. He's doing pretty good, all things considered. He beat his original life expectancy of 18, and now probably has a long life ahead of him. Steve needs a wheelchair to move and a ventilator to help him breathe. The book, Health Justice Now, Timothy Faust.
This week on The Science Revolution, about that happiness. Is it time to stop being so careful? Is spontaneity the key to happiness? Professor Janice Brainy is here on plastic rain pouring down in our national parks and everywhere. Tony Corbo with Food and Water Watch drops by to warn Americans the USDA is trying to outsource chicken processing to China and what that means. Tune in wherever you find fine podcasts. Welcome back. Thom Hartmann here with you. The increasingly what we're seeing now is Republican women abandoning Donald Trump, and some men as well, but in particular women. I think what's going on is that people are saying, I'm a Republican, I'm all in favor of limited government and low taxes and, let the polluters do what they want. I don't care. I probably won't get cancer. I live in an affluent white neighborhood. This is, how Republicans think. This is what they're saying. And, but, I don't want to die from this virus. I really think that's what it comes down to. When you looked at that crowd that showed up for his rally in Tulsa, Oklahoma, you were not looking at the upscale Republicans that I was just describing, living in the upscale white neighborhood and not having to worry about pollution and, a power plant down the street or poisoned water like Flint, Michigan has. And by the way, about a quarter of all water supplies in the United States. That's not who we saw. The people that we saw showing up for Trump's rally tended to be the lower income portion of the Republican Party. The people who love to wave the Confederate flag, who are in it for the racism, who are in it for the hate. They don't love Trump because he's cutting taxes. They don't love Trump because he's reducing regulations and poisoning our air and water and selling off public lands for pennies on the dollar to oil oligarchs and billionaires and mining companies. They don't love him because he's putting right-wing judges on the courts who are going to strip more union protections and more human rights and civil rights. They don't love him for any of those reasons. They love him because he hates the same people they hate. It's just that simple. That's who we saw showing up at the Trump rally in Tulsa, Oklahoma. People who love Trump because he hates the same people they hate, and he lives in the same little bubble that they live in, this Fox News, One America News bubble, where the coronavirus is just a bad case of the flu, Donald Trump is the finest man ever, there is a group inside the government who are working to take down the deep state and the drug addicts and child sex traffickers that are affiliated with Hillary Clinton. These are the people who showed up. And the bad news for Donald Trump is that Republicans can't win elections with the Confederate flag waving, racist faction or fraction of the Republican coalition. And then he goes to this, fundamentalist church in Arizona yesterday, and, they're starting to back away. And pretty soon, a lot of them are going to be sick. We're seeing some of the worst transmission in the country now is coming out of churches. It happened here in Oregon. We've got a county where when Kate Brown, our governor, had locked down the state and said, churches can't have meetings unless they limit it to a certain number of people and they socially distance and people wear masks and all this stuff. And what happened? A right-wing Pentecostal church here in Oregon held a service. In fact, they live streamed it on Facebook just to kind of shove it in Kate Brown's face, the governor. And that church now accounts for virtually all the coronavirus cases in that particular county. But that's not enough to win an election. He needs the racist part of the Republican coalition, which is about a third of them. He needs the upscale ideologues, the ones who come up with the rationalizations, those guys. He needs that part of the coalition, and then he needs the people who just always thought, well, yeah, this is kind of my dad's Republican Party. Yes, I'm a conservative. I believe in moving society forward. It's a good thing, but let's do it cautiously, slowly. Let's not disrupt things. Which I think for many of those people means don't disrupt white privilege, frankly. I personally don't think that's what it meant for my dad, but he's not around. I can't ask him, and we certainly weren't having conversations in this context back when he was still alive. But those are the coalitions that are necessary for a Republican to get elected. And I think that the part of that Republican coalition, the roughly 2/3 of that Republican coalition who are a little more affluent or extremely affluent and white, because the entire Republican Party is white. Tim Scott is the exception that literally proves the rule. I think the rest of them are saying, that's all well and good, and under other circumstances, I would have supported you, doing away with the FDA and the EPA and everybody else. But right now, I don't want to get sick. They just don't want to die. And they get it that, Donald Trump is going to make them die or let them die. Anyhow, let's pick up your phone calls here. Lawrence in St. Paul, Minnesota. Hey, Lawrence, thanks for listening to KTNF. What's up?
Always a pleasure. Hey, Tom, what are we doing here as Democrats? Every day we sit here and talk about what this guy's doing. We're not doing ourselves any favors as Democrats. We're actually losing. And if we keep this up, we're going to lose.
Lawrence, that's simply not the case. The fact, look at what just came down in terms of the election results. These primaries. Not only are Democrats winning, progressives are winning inside the Democratic Party. Yesterday, by the way, Jill Biden name-checked both Kamala Harris and Elizabeth Warren. I see this as a good sign. Two of the most progressive. I'm not sure I want, Susan Rice is a fine person and all that, but she's not a progressive, not even close. I just completely disagree with you. Sorry. Mike in Hope Sound, Florida. Hey, Mike, what's up?
Hey, Tom, pleasure. Glad to see you disagree with some misinformation there, because that was not exactly what is the truth. But I want to talk about my one key issue, which is always the same. Trump and dog whistles, and you started mentioning the words he was using in that speech, and that was a symphony of racist lies and dog whistles. And I want to remind every American, everybody who pretends to be a Christian, everyone who pretends to be a patriot, look back in history, look at Joe McCarthy. Donald Trump is as evil as Joe McCarthy was, and as ignorant. But Trump is much.
And keep in mind, Roy Cohn was Joe McCarthy's lawyer. Roy Cohn was Donald Trump's lawyer.
Geez, why are you stealing my thunder, Tom?
Oh, I'm sorry, Mike. Were you building up to that?
No, I was just going to say that Joe McCarthy needed Roy Cohn because of the brains. And now we have the two of them in one human being who was elected by Americans to lead this country.
No, he was actually elected by the Electoral College. I mean, I was going to say he was elected by the Russisians, but it goes beyond that. The Saudis were involved in this. There were some Israeli oligarchs involved in this. Go ahead.
Let's not forget the key person, the people that got him elected. The people that got him elected was the Republican establishment, the Republican Party, and every voter who didn't stand up against him. And that includes non-voters who are a huge part of this country. I tell everybody, if you don't want to study history, if you don't want to study Joe McCarthy and McCarthyism, you don't want to study what Roy Cohn did to this country, I never thought, growing up through Nixon and John Mitchell, that we would ever see a worse attorney general than John Mitchell. And lo and behold, Nixon and Mitchell are looking like saints right about now. It's the worst I've ever seen. And I see the worst in these supporters that continue. And that includes every supporter who says to me, go ahead.
Well, here's the good news, Mike. You know what happened to John Mitchell. Finish your thought about, though, you were saying. We got about a minute.
He got too little jail time, and but he did go to jail. And that was a different time, too. We had Republicans in the early 70s who actually did have a conscience, and that has gone away. But I will say this. I live in Florida, and I'm constantly inundated with people that are burning masks and calling it an infringement on their liberty, and I push back directly. I will not stand for it. I'm an American, but I'm a human being as well, and I use my God-given brain. So get out and vote, people, and don't vote for third party if you don't have a chance. Vote for the Democrats. At least this time, do something for the country.
Yeah, let's not piss away our votes, as the old semi-obscene saying goes. And
that's right.
This is no time to waste your vote on any third party, frankly, and we can all sit around and talk about our long litany of complaints about the Democratic Party, but if we don't get inside that party and change it, we lose basically our right to complain. Mike, thanks for the call. Well said. We'll be back. It's 45 minutes past the hour here on the Thom Hartmann Program, defending America from the conservative weapons of mass deception. Thom Hartmann here with you. We'll be back. Stick around. Pick up more of your phone calls here. This ultra-Trumpy judge. I mean, I don't think this is the end here. We'll see how this plays out. But a John Mitchell outcome, that'd be a good thing.
Thom Hartmann. Visit thomhartmann.com for audio and video archives.
Bill Barr needs to remember that Richard Nixon's Attorney General went to prison. We'll be right back. And welcome back. Let's see here. Mick in Seattle. Hey, Mick, what's up?
Tom, thank you. Good morning. I'm really glad to hear you when you rant and rave. I love it because sometimes you're spot on. This time you said something I'd like clarification on. You said, I'd like to know where you got the necessitant man, I hope I'm saying that right, is not free. And I love the fact that you said that.
In 1933, in March of 1933, when Franklin Roosevelt was sworn in and he gave his inaugural address, the one where he famously said, "The only thing we have to fear is fear itself." He also said, "An old English judge once said, a necessitous man is not a free man." And then he goes on to chronicle essentially what I said. So that's where it came from. And then in 1936, when Roosevelt gave his famous speech, I believe it was in Philadelphia, where he accepted his renomination for a second term, he quoted himself. He said, "Necessitous men are not free." He didn't quote the old English judge that time, but that's where it came from, Mick.
Thank you for sharing that with me and the rest of us.
You're welcome. Thanks a lot for the call. It's nice to hear from you. Dennis in Aptos, California. Hey, Dennis, what's up?
Yeah, hi. Well, I'm glad the conversation's kind of gone back to that period of time when I was about 14 or 15, 16, the late 60s, early 70s. And I wanted to ask you a question, Tom. During that time, would you have thought that someone you probably wouldn't have thought that Nixon might have gotten elected or reelected, or that Reagan might have been elected. But did you think that people from our first half of the baby boomer generation would end up voting for someone like Reagan by 1980? Because my sister did. She was a real hippie in the late 60s.
Yeah. There was I think the election of 68 is very different from the election of 1980. The election of 68, when Richard Nixon took power, was really all about Vietnam and about the failure of Lyndon Johnson to end the war in Vietnam. And it turns out that Lyndon Johnson actually had ended the war in Vietnam, and Richard Nixon inserted himself into that process, told the South Vietnamese, just hang on, don't go along with this, and I'll make you rich. And so, Nixon committed treason. In 1980, though, and so we just didn't know. We thought that we were ousting a corrupt and incompetent, warmongering Democratic candidate, Hubert Humphrey, the vice president to LBJ, and replacing him with a Republican who had spent 8 years as the vice president of Dwight Eisenhower, who was widely beloved and who had ended the Korean War. And Richard Nixon ran as an anti-war candidate in 68. So we thought he was going to end the war. And then in 72, when he ran for re-election, he again said he was going to end the war. He had a secret plan, you'll recall. But in 1980, we had these twin oil shocks in the 1970s that I believe they were 3 or 4 years apart, and they were the result of the Arabs basically freaking out about Israel. And so we had inflation, we had a recession, you had the hostages being held by Iran. We didn't know, again, that Reagan's campaign had cut a deal with the Iranians to hold the hostages all the way up to literally to the minute that Reagan put his hand on the Bible. And so people thought, I'd say in both cases, Dennis, people thought they were voting for a better America. Dennis, thanks for the call. We'll be back. Hey, we're putting together a series of American history books. It started with a hidden history of guns and the Second Amendment. Then we had the hidden history of the Supreme Court, the betrayal of America. Then the hidden history of the Republican war on voting. Coming out soon is the hidden history of monopolies, how big business destroyed the American dream. And then next spring, it's going to be the hidden history of oligarchy and tyranny. Hey, we just put up a new video for supporters of our program. You can find it over at thomhartmann.com. Talking about the relationship between Fox News, Rupert Murdoch, and basically the whole right-wing hate agenda on Hispanics, by and large, saying that Hispanics are changing our culture. Really? This is European culture. I mean, the Mayans and Aztecs got replaced by the Spaniards, remember? They're mostly Catholic. I don't see the cultural difference here, but Fox sure does. And also pointing out that Kevin Rudd, the former Prime Minister of Australia, calls out Rupert Murdoch and says, he's, quote, a cancer on Australian democracy. Well, apparently a cancer on American democracy as well. So you can check out this new video over at thomhartmann.com. It's just available to people who are, supporters of our program. Welcome back. Thom Hartmann here with you. Oh, bummer. There was a caller on the board, and Joyce had noted that this person wanted to disagree with me and tell me how wrong I was. And I was going to put them up as soon as we came back from the break, and they must have gotten an owie and left. People who disagree with me always go to the front of the line. Well, usually. Oh, wait a minute. There is one. Here's another one. Larry in Hot Springs, Arkansas. Hey, Larry, you disagree with me? How so?
I disagree with something you said, respectfully.
Okay, go for it. Okay.
You made the comment that the only people that went to the rally in Tulsa are basically white supremacists.
No, I didn't say white supremacists. But I wouldn't disagree with that characterization, and I didn't say all of the people. I said what I was seeing on the TV screen were the same basic, in the way that they were dressing, the way that they were behaving. These were the folks that you see, in those circles. Anyhow, make your point, Larry.
Well, I support the president. I voted. I'm a registered independent, so I can go either way. I used to live in Arkansas. I don't. I live in Missouri now. But when Bill Clinton was governor here, I voted for him. He also promised the people of Arkansas that he wouldn't run for president, and he did. So I didn't vote for him for president. I do better. I'm doing better now, and a lot of people I know are doing much better under President Trump than we did under President Obama and Vice President Biden.
Right.
And I
with
don't.
40 million unemployed people, with wages flat, with his first official act of office saying coal companies could poison downstream communities. Larry, outside of, it sounds to me like what you're saying, Larry, is that you are such a profoundly and deeply uninformed voter that when your paycheck is good, you vote for whoever's in office, and when your paycheck isn't good, you vote against them. Do I have that right?
No, sir. I vote for whoever I feel is going to do the best job.
Right. Okay. All right. So you're voting your feelings. I got it, Larry. I think we've run out of stuff to talk about here. Alex in Cranberry Township, Pennsylvania. Hey, Alex, what's up?
Hey, Tom. First-time caller. Pleasure to speak with you. I love the show. I just wanted to ask a question. A lot of the people I talk to when politics comes up, they feel that the far left, what they perceive to be the far left, is a bigger threat than the far right. Like, for example, Antifa, et cetera. How do I get them to understand that it's the opposite? How do I explain that better?
Well, I just ask a real simple question. When was the last time somebody in the far left killed an American for ideological purposes? It's happening on the far right at the rate of, dozens a year.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because sometimes they like to bring up cancel culture a lot of the time. Like what happens on, they always talk about college campuses and I just find it really, there's a disconnect there because, like you said, the violence is all on the right.
Well, the cancel culture thing is what you see, and you see it in every society, in every culture, when a culture goes through an awakening and a process of change. I mean, this was, the French Revolution was cancel culture on steroids. They did away with the calendar because the months of the year were named after Greek gods, and they didn't believe in any gods. They banned religion. They brought out the guillotine and started cutting people's heads off. I think what's happened, and that's not to say that this is the French Revolution, but my point is that whether it was Me Too or whether it's tearing down statues and things, all things that I support and that I think most people do support, there will be some folks who will push the boundaries and essentially go over the top. That's a normal part of the process. That's actually a healthy thing. You want that. That's a sign that society is actually changing. So when you've got a major shift, when you've got a major change, there will be, the change will go farther than the broad, society overall would find reasonable, and then it'll pull back to somewhat to a new normal. But that's just like the shift from the old normal to the new normal. There's, it bounces around a little. I guess that's what I'm trying to say. And
yeah, okay.
I don't see that as a bad thing.
Okay, yeah, sounds good. Yeah, thanks. And I don't either. It just strikes me as really interesting how, somehow it's the far left that's more of a threat than the far right. I get it. It's like, I think we all went too far in going after Al Franken and the Prairie Home Companion guy, probably. Maybe not. But the point is, that's the price you pay for doing away with an old part of your culture that in this case was misogynistic. Now we're dealing with the racist part of our culture. There's going to be some people, bumped out who probably weren't enemies, but still, that's the price you pay. It's okay.
You're listening to Thom Hartmann.
So we've got a new video up over at thomhartmann.com for people who support our program, and it's there's a really troubling concatenation of events, events, that are happening in the United States right now. We created these concentration camps for refugees seeking asylum. This was Stephen Miller's big project. And we've got concentration camps for children, concentration camps for male adults, concentration camps for female adults. And now we've got this virus sweeping through the United States, and people are starting to die in these concentration camps, which has provoked ICE or whoever's running them to deport hundreds of the children back to the countries that they came from without their parents, which is mind-boggling, and in many cases carrying disease. This is serious stuff, and we need to be talking about it. The new video is over at thomhartmann.com.
Our book today in the Thom Hartmann Book Club is Stand Up, Struggle Forward by Sanyika Shakur. This is a book that was written back in the late 90s, but it's still very, very timely. This is from the second chapter titled Class Antagonisms Inside the Fundamental Contradiction of National Oppression. Having just passed the 19th and quickly approaching the 20th anniversary of the LA Rebellion, we should be reminded here of what Rodney King whimpered as he stood in front of a bank of microphones surrounded by class enemies and neo-colonial politicians. We should remember how he'd been dressed in that non-threatening cardigan sweater, white shirt, and black tie, how his hair had been tortured into submission by a jerry curl. We should reflect as well upon how timid and spooked he looked, and on how concerned and stern those who flanked him were as well. That was a Kodak moment. It was staged to foster an image of contrition and resignation, submission, a victim. Rodney King had been led to believe, through a bourgeois sense of reasoning, that the rebellion was really about him, that the reason new Africans and Mexicanos took to the streets of South Central was the result of his filmed beating. That, of course, is typical of mechanical bourgeois thinking. What it's not typical of, however, is someone from the hood. And this cuts both ways. No one in the hoods and barrios ever thought it was about Rodney King. We'd all seen the film over and over like everyone else, but that was par for the course. We'd always seen that, long before anybody caught it on tape. Actually, we'd experienced much more than that. Why, it's safe to say that the hoods had gone to war with each other in vicious waves of internal, intra-class combat for much less than that. Though, because of a general colonial mentality which prevents the challenging of bottom-up oppression, the same hood forces will not, in any systemic way, wage war on the pigs, or for freedom, land, and socialism. Rodney King alone, and of his own accord, would not have thought to hold a press conference to ask the asinine question, in the form of a whimpering request, can't we just all get along? The fact of the matter is, we are getting along. New Africans and Mexicanos are getting along just fine. What we couldn't understand was why he was admonishing us for getting at the exploiters of our communities. The impression he gave, with his handler's hands up his back like a ventriloquist troll, was that a race riot was going on, as if we had all been to kill each other or burn and rob each other's homes. His handlers compelled him to send up a false flag, a diversion. But you see, this was the very thing that exposed the class interests and reactionary politics of the Uncle Toms that had been designated to handle him, and by extension, us. Let's go back for a minute. Let's talk social development, aka history. There exists a fundamental contradiction in our lives that, like an elephant in the room, no one wants to acknowledge. As a consequence of the war waged upon various African nations by European powers, those of us captured and kidnapped were taken out of our own self-determining social developments and violently forced into Euro-American history. This is not simply a clever play on words. This is a reality. We lost the ability to control our own destiny. Read that again. From that time until now, the fundamental basic contradiction between the U.S. oppressor nation and our own oppressed and colonized nation has been the governing imperialist relationship, which is to say, us not being in control of the qualitative factors that determine our lives as a people, as a nation. Our tradition of struggle against this fundamental contradiction has taken many forms, some hidden or obscured, some open and hostile. But all of these have been open to resolve the fundamental contradiction and to regain our independence. While there have been some bona fide struggles to resolve the contradiction, there have also been reactionary neocolonial struggles waged by internal enemies loyal to the oppressor nation and culture that have tried time and time again to subvert and control our destiny for the benefit of the capitalists. They've come among us, always imposed from above, stirring up emotions and giving lip service to progress, equality, justice, and prosperity. These always within the colonial confines of the oppressor's arrangements. And none collectively ever materialize, because without a resolution of the fundamental contradiction, that is the freeing of our productive forces from U.S. imperialism and the governing of our own affairs, we'll remain a minority within the American system as opposed to a majority in our own, and subjected to the established bourgeois social contract, i.e. colonialism, neo and post. We can parade all through the empire with black congressmen, black mayors, black governors, black police chiefs, black Supreme Court justices, hell, even a black president. And absolutely nothing will alter the genocidal relationship that governs our national oppression here, because the blacks are part of the colonial apparatus. They have made a strategic alliance with the capitalist imperialists to act as go-betweens in our oppression and exploitation. This is a conscious class stand. The black petty bourgeois is not innocently confused, like, say, Mrs. Jackson across the street is, about our national oppression, about the existence and subjugation of New Africa. They are well-read, have traveled in our experience. They've just chosen sides against us and in favor of our historical enemies. And the sooner we recognize and internalize this, the better off we'll be. Black ain't nothing but a color. As a designation of our national identity, it has played out. It is a superficial understanding at best and a foolish and dangerous analysis at worst. We have no collective control over the qualitative factors which determine our lives. We do not, in other words, control our destiny, not as a people or a state. The book is Stand Up, Struggle Forward by Sanyika Shakur.
This is the Thom Hartmann Program.
Welcome back. Thom Hartmann here with you. Jeffrey D. Sachs, a university professor, director of the Center for Sustainable Development at Columbia University, has produced some just absolutely extraordinary work over the years. The Age of Sustainable Development back in 2015, Building a New American Economy in 2017, A New Foreign Policy Beyond American Exceptionalism. He has a new book out. His website, by the way, Jeff Sachs, SACHS.org. You can tweet him at Jeff D. Sachs. He has a new book out. It's called Ages of Globalization, and it's fascinating, thought-provoking, in-depth analysis of kind of the history of globalization going back 70-some-odd thousand years ago. Professor Sachs, welcome back to the program. It's been a while. Thank you for writing this new book and for joining us.
Tom, I hope you're well. How are you doing?
I am. Yes, knock wood. So, you go through the 7 ages of globalization: the Paleolithic, the Neolithic, the Equestrian, the Classical Age, the Ocean Age, the Industrial Age, and now the Digital Age. Give us a snapshot of what you're talking about here. Explain what you mean by this.
The idea is to try to understand how humanity has related with each other, especially through trade and migration, long-distance spread of ideas throughout human history. When I was first studying economics many decades ago, I thought, my God, we are opening a new period called globalization. It took me quite a while to understand that while there are unique aspects of our globalization compared to the past, we've been at this global affair for quite a long time. And to understand the dynamics of global change, I came to understand over the course of my career and policy work that you really did need to understand the interactions of geography, the climate, the physical resources, the location of economies, how those interacted with the institutions of government, politics, and so forth, with fundamentally the changes of our know-how, our technologies, perhaps the most fundamental driver of change of them all. And in this overview of human globalization, of long-distance interactions, I emphasize this three-way understanding, taking physical nature, technological change, and ideas, culture, politics as three sides that are constantly interacting. I believe it helps us to understand what's happening right now, which is mass disruption to our lives, our understanding, our nature of global interaction. So that's the purpose of the book.
So what does this mean for us today? I mean, well, I'll just leave that question right there.
Yeah, what I think is stunning and upsetting and unnerving is that we are absolutely entering a new phase of globalization. Many days in the COVID pandemic, we hear, is globalization over? Are we reverting to national or local economies? The answer is certainly not, especially in an age driven by digital technologies, which are instantaneously bringing knowledge and all aspects of our economic life within global reach. So we're not reverting to any kind of local economics. We're more interconnected than ever, and that's a basic truth. But what's also happening is that we are experiencing a deep disruption to how our economies work. COVID is obvious. It couldn't be more dramatic, of course, but what it has done is to dramatically accelerate the digitalization of every aspect of our economic life. Most of us are working from home. Payments, commerce, governance is all now online. Not all of it, of course, but a remarkable amount. Within a few weeks, hundreds of millions of kids went to school online, completely unexpectedly. But while with lots of difficulties, more seamlessly than one could have imagined over the course of just a few weeks. At the same time, global politics is changing absolutely rapidly. Again, in this case, accelerated both by the pandemic and by Trump, who is the most incoherent and narrow-minded president we've ever had. He's actually accelerating what was already underway, which is the end of the American-led global era to now a truly multipolar global era where China, East Asia more generally, India, Africa, Europe are each more independently acting and interacting regions. So I think we're entering a new kind of geopolitics. The U.S. has basically abandoned leadership under the weird and unhelpful banner of America First, which is getting us deeper and deeper into trouble on many fronts. But even beside that point, we are now in a different kind of global politics, and
right.
Much of the day-to-day conflict that we're seeing with China, or the rhetorical skirmishing with China, is really a reflection of this global change. The third aspect of our global reality, of course, is nature itself. COVID-19 is only the most recent of a wave of emerging new diseases that reflect in a fundamental way how humanity is impinging on nature and thereby triggering new so-called zoonotic events where pathogens, viruses, bacteria, and so forth spread from animal populations to human populations. In this case, from bats to humans, probably somewhere in southwest China originally. But this is just one of a series of such pandemics, SARS and Ebola and Middle East respiratory syndrome being three other recent zoonotic emergent diseases. And sad to say, there will be more to come. But that's part of an even larger environmental story, of course, Tom, as you know, climate change, mass pollution, destruction of the biosphere. In short, we are in a new global era, which will change fundamentally how we live, how we interact, and what we have to do to stay safe.
It's remarkable. We have just a little less than a minute left, and you've raised so many large issues here. The digital revolution. I'm wondering your let me just pick that. I'm wondering your thoughts on the emergence of digital oligarchs. Essentially, Zuckerberg and Facebook have now said that science about climate change is going to be treated like opinion on Facebook, so the climate change deniers can do whatever they want. Are we? Is this new digital age going to be one that's controlled by an oligarchy, essentially?
We are in the robber baron era of the new digital economy, where Bezos and Zuckerberg and a few others think they call the shots, and for the short term they do. I don't think this will last long. It is phenomenal that in a short period of time, Bezos gained $50 billion in the few weeks of this pandemic. It's not going to last. We're going to be taxing them, we're going to be regulating them, and we're going to be regarding these technologies as a common ownership of humanity, not the ownership of a few people.
From your lips to God's ears. Professor Jeffrey D. Sachs, the new book, Ages of Globalization. Thank you, sir.
Good to be with you. Thank you so much,
Thom Hartmann Program.
Thank you. Professor Sachs, an extraordinary book. I spent several hours with it yesterday. It is fascinating. We'll be right back. And welcome back. Richard in Pasadena, California. Hey, Richard, what's on your mind today?
What's on my mind is whether or not we're feudal serfs and our police department. I have a quote, if you'll let me read it, from a 1787. The means of defense against foreign dangers historically have become the instruments of tyranny at home. Throughout all Europe, the armies kept under the pretext of defending have enslaved the people.
Yeah, it sounds like something that Jefferson or some of his anti-army colleagues would have said.
Yeah, James Madison.
James Madison, yeah, okay.
Yeah.
Jefferson's protege. Absolutely. And this is why they put into the Constitution that the entire Congress every 2 years has to decide again every 2 years whether they want to have a standing army during times of peace. Now, we haven't had a time of peace in quite some time, but, the 2-year requirement still stands. And, I think to a large extent we have become feudal serfs, and I think that that's probably a pretty good analogy, feudalism and serfdom. So,
we're enslaved, for sure.
Yeah.
Hey, can I say just one more thing about Richard Wolff the other day said that there were 315 million billionaires before the pandemic, and then they've added 15 billionaires since. I'm wondering, isn't there one common sense billionaire who can fund Pacifica Radio and free speech radio and television? I mean, this is crazy that this is out in the limb like
Wouldn't that be nice? No, it was a group of oligarchs who helped put together the Rush Limbaugh show. It was oligarchs who took over, iHeartRadio, also known as Clear Channel back in the day. It was oligarchs who took over Cumulus Radio. It was oligarchs Comcast oligarchs who took over NBC. To the best of my knowledge, I have not seen any left-wing oligarchs exhibit any interest in media. And in fact, I wrote an open letter to Tom Steyer back a year ago, maybe thereabouts, during the primaries, in which I said, if you're going to put your money and efforts into something, instead of running for president, you should buy iHeartRadio. And at that particular point, it was for sale. And it was for sale for about $1.1 billion. And it would have made a great investment. I mean, it'll actually produce revenue. It'll make money if it's well run. And, you could put good progressive programming on it. And he never responded to that. I think it's real unfortunate, Richard. Ralph Nader, who wrote the foreword to my new book on monopoly, back 6, 8, 10 years ago, wrote a book called Only the Super Rich Can Save Us Now, in which he basically argued that because the Supreme Court has enabled oligarchy in the United States so that we now have government run of, by, and for super rich people, that the super rich people of goodwill are going to have to step up and step in and make things happen. And to a large extent, George Soros has been doing that much of his life, but he's been doing it on the world stage, and he's been doing it with big issues like the fate and future of democracy, small d democracy. But in terms of getting your hands dirty, like Charles Koch has done his entire life, I'm not seeing that on the left, and I think it's a real tragedy. Richard, thank you for the call. Coming up on 20 minutes past the hour. We'll be right back with more of your calls and the news of the day and your thoughts. Stick around. Our 1-hour free podcast recaps our show, and it's available wherever fine podcasts are found. And we have the full 3-hour podcast available over at thomhartmann.com if you want to really support our program. The story that I mentioned to Professor Sachs is actually a big deal. Judd Legum over at popular.info. This is his story for the day. The headline, Facebook creates fact-checking exemption for climate deniers. Now, Facebook has been saying that if somebody publishes a, quote, news story on Facebook, whether it's an ad in the context of an ad or whether it's just, you posted something, if it is fake news, literally, if it's just something that was made up, if it's clickbait, if it's naked lies, they're going to ban it. And this right-wing organization funded by fossil fuel deniers, or climate change deniers, it's called the CO2 Coalition. Isn't that a sweet name? Carbon Dioxide Coalition. Yes, we love carbon dioxide. They actually published a booklet talking about how, I believe it was them, I know the Heartland Institute did as well, a book saying that plants need CO2, so we need more CO2 because we need more plants. It's food, don't you know? Which is just bad science, right? When you increase CO2 levels and plants actually get weaker, not stronger. They may grow faster, but that makes them weaker. But in any case, they had published this article saying that, there's nothing to see here. The climate crisis is not a crisis. They were challenging science. And Facebook inexplicably said, well, this isn't science. This isn't something that you can say, yes, it's true, or no, it's not. This is opinion. And so we're not going to take it down. And here's how they plan. The CO2 Coalition now plans to quote this. This is from E&E News. After the quiet decision by Facebook, the coalition said it and other groups that attack consensus climate science can now share content that climate scientists have labeled as misleading because Facebook will consider it opinion and therefore immune to fact-checking. See, they only check facts on things that are claimed as news. But if you're talking about climate change, well, that's opinion. No fact-checking there. The CO2 Coalition is increasingly focused on using Facebook to reach more people with its message that climate change fears are overblown and that burning more fossil fuels would actually help humanity. Executive Director Caleb Rossiter told E&E News this week he sees the battle over its climate-related posts as part of a larger proxy war over how to reach an audience outside of conservative media. And that's what they're talking about, is right now the climate change deniers are pretty much isolated in this little world of Fox News and right-wing hate radio, which is only reaching, at best, a third of Americans. Facebook is huge. Facebook was the principal weapon that was used by the Trump campaign in 2016, and they're using it right now. I mean, they're spending $1 million a day on Facebook on ads that are demonstrably filled with lies. And Facebook has said, yeah, but that's politics. We don't fact-check politics either. And now Facebook has said, climate change, no, that's not news, that's opinion. The CO2 Coalition says it's getting assistance from, quote, a conservative Facebook employee. Really? Facebook says that's not true, but they didn't say who was the person at Facebook who reversed the ruling or who ruled that science that having to do with climate change is not actually science, it's opinion. And so what you've got here is a multi-billion-dollar industry, the fossil fuel industry, dancing with one of the wealthiest multi-billionaire oligarchs in America, Mark Zuckerberg, to promote oligarchic interests using a platform that is, functionally a monopoly. And that all across America, people are using Facebook. They're not going on Facebook saying, gee, I want to hear the latest climate denying news. They're going to Facebook because they want to see what's going on with Grandpa. What's happening with, Aunt Nellie? What's happening with Uncle Bob? Where are the kids this week? What are their friends up to? What are people doing? That's why people are on Facebook. But because they're there looking for, personal information, it has become the place where you've got, the white supremacists, the Boogaloo Boys, and these other white supremacist groups organizing massively. Virtually all of their organizing, or a huge percentage of their organizing, happening over on Facebook. And Facebook is doing virtually nothing about this. And then now you've got the climate deniers, who are very concerned that lots and lots of young people are waking up to this crisis and seriously upset about the world that the older generation is about to hand to them. That this is, hey, what better way to reach out to these young people and mold their minds, provide them with information. And what better way to reach out to people who might be consuming Fox News and right-wing hate radio and believing that climate change is a lie, with something that will reinforce their worldview, their opinions, that'll further solidify those opinions, that'll make them feel more comfortable saying to somebody who says, climate science is real, oh, no, it's not. I know it's not. I read it on Facebook. Facebook does fact-checking. This is really ominous. And then on top of that, right now, we have a man in the White House, the President of the United States, saying that climate change is a Chinese hoax or a Democrat hoax. Take your choice. I mean, it depends on which day of the week it is that, he says one or the other of these two things. But, we've got some serious issues here. Anyhow, I'll pick up your phone calls on the other side of this break. It's coming up on 28 minutes past the hour. It's the Thom Hartmann Program, the place where smart people get their news. What's going on? With the entire Republican Party, is Bill Barr going to survive this? Is the GOP going to survive this?
You're listening to the Thom Hartmann Program. Call 202-808-9925.
Or is the Republican Party going to have to literally reinvent themselves from scratch? We'll be back.
Our book today in the Thom Hartmann Book Club is Medical Apartheid, The Dark History of Medical Experimentation on Black Americans from Colonial Times to the Present by Harriet A. Washington. This is from the introduction. On a sylvan stretch of New York's patrician Upper Fifth Avenue, just across from the New York Academy of Medicine, a colossus in marble, august inscriptions, and a bas-relief caduceus grace a memorial bordering Central Park. These laurels venerate the surgeon James Marion Sims, MD, as a selfless benefactor of women. Nor is this the only statuary erected in honor of Dr. Sims. Marble monuments to his skill, benevolence, and humanity guard his native South Carolina's State House, its medical school, the Alabama Capitol grounds, and a French hospital. In the mid-19th century, Dr. Sims dedicated his career to the care and cure of women's disorders and opened the nation's first hospital for women in New York City. He attended French royalty. His Grecian visage inspired oil portraits, and in 1875 he was elected president of the American Medical Association. Hospitals still bear his name, including a West African hospital that utilizes the eponymous gynecological instruments that he at first invented for surgeries upon black female slaves in the 1840s. But this benevolent image vies with the detached Marion Sims portrayed in Robert Thom's J. Marion Sims, Gynecological Surgeon, an oil representation of an experimental surgery upon his powerless slave, Betsy. Sims stands aloof, arms folded, one hand holding a metroscope, the forerunner of the speculum, as he regards the kneeling woman in a coolly evaluative medical gaze. His tie and morning coat contrast with her simple servant's dress, head rag, and bare feet. The painting, commissioned and distributed by the Park Davis Pharmaceutical House more than a century after the surgeries, as one of its History and Medicine in Pictures series, takes telling liberties with the historical facts. Thom portrays Betsy as a fully clothed, calm slave woman who kneels complacently on a small table, hand modestly raised to her breast before a trio of white male physicians. Two other slave women peer around a sheet, apparently hung for modesty's sake, in a childlike display of curiosity. This innocuous tableau could hardly differ more from the gruesome reality in which each surgical scene was a violent struggle between the slaves and physicians, and each woman's body was a bloodied battleground. Each naked, unanesthetized slave woman had to be forcibly restrained by the other physicians through her shrieks of agony as Sims determinedly sliced, then sutured her genitalia. The other doctors who could fled when they could bear the horrific screams no longer. It then fell to the women to restrain one another. I wanted to reproduce Thom's painting on the cover of this book, or at least in the text, but when I asked permission of its copyright holder, Pfizer Incorporated, the company insisted on reviewing the entire manuscript of this book before making a decision. As an independent scholar, I could not acquiesce to this, and I used another cover image. When I renewed my request to use the image within the text, Pfizer agreed to base its decision upon reading this chapter and an outline of the book. The Pfizer executives apparently were uncomfortable with what they read because they refused to grant permission to reproduce this telling image or even respond to my query after I supplied the requested chapter and outline. This act of censorship exemplifies the barriers some choose to erect in order to veil the history of unconscionable medical research with blacks. Betsy's voice has been silenced by history, but as one reads Sims' biographers and his own memoirs, a haughty, self-absorbed researcher emerges, a man who bought black women slaves and addicted them to morphine in order to perform dozens of exquisitely painful, distressingly intimate vaginal surgeries. Not until he had experimented with his surgeries on Betsy and her fellow slaves for years did Sims essay to cure white women. Was Sims a savior or a sadist? It depends, I suppose, on the color of the women you ask. Marion Sims epitomizes the two faces, one benign, one malevolent, of American medical research. Quote, "Of all the forms of inequality, injustice in health is the most shocking and the most inhumane." In 1965, Martin Luther King Jr. spoke those words in Montgomery, Alabama, at the end of the Selma to Montgomery march that had been attended by the black and white physicians of the Medical Committee for Human Rights. King had invited the doctors not only to give medical help to injured marchers, but also to witness the abuse suffered at the hands of segregationists. With these almost unnoticed words, King ushered in a new era in civil rights because, as Delegate to Congress Donna Christensen Christian, MD, chair of the Congressional Black Caucus Health Brain Trust, has declared, health disparities are the civil rights issue of the 21st century. Thus, Dr. King's alarm over racial health injustice was prescient, and were he alive today, his concerns would be redoubled. Mounting evidence of the racial health divide confronts us everywhere we look, from doubled black infant death rates to African American life expectancies that fall years behind whites. Infant mortality of African Americans is twice that of whites. The book, Medical Apartheid by Harriet A. Washington.
This week on The Science Revolution, about that happiness. Is it time to stop being so careful? Is spontaneity the key to happiness? Professor Janice Brainy is here on plastic rain pouring down in our national parks and everywhere. Tony Corbo with Food and Water Watch drops by to warn Americans the USDA is trying to outsource chicken processing to China and what that means. Tune in wherever you find fine podcasts.
Hey, we have a new video up for the supporters of our program over at thomhartmann.com. I really enjoy doing these separate from what we're doing on the air because sometimes I can say things that would be impolitic or inappropriate to say on the air. Like the name of the website that I'm talking about in this video, and I lay it out and share it with you on the video. It's ratbleepingthecourts.com, and the bleeping, of course, is a word that you just can't say on the air that starts with F. And this website is just outing these judges that Donald Trump and the Federalist Society have been sending through Mitch McConnell's Senate like a friggin' assembly line, and how unqualified they are, how hateful they are, how aggressively they've worked to screw students, to deny. Well, one of them actually said that women who are on birth control pills, that should be reason to fire people. Right? I mean, it's just insane. You can check it out over at thomhartmann.com.
And welcome back. Thom Hartmann here with you. Marcus in Griggs, Idaho. Hey, Marcus says here you disagree with me. What's up?
Hello, Thom Hartmann. I want to say that you are a loser, spelled with a U. And all liberals, you guys are really messed up in the head. The bot flies matter thing is really messed up, and you guys are trying to destroy America. I don't like it. It pisses me off.
Marcus, these are all generalities. You want to give me something specific that you're concerned about?
Yeah, I'm concerned about the man who has a Latin Kings tattoo on my job site, on his neck. I don't like that. That is messed up. People toppling statues.
I beg your pardon?
Yeah, that's
what are you
my
talking
country.
about?
I'm talking about people toppling statues in my country. My family's been here since the 1500s. We've traced it back, and we are part of the fabric of America. We are on both sides, but I honor my people from the Confederate side just as much as I honor people from the North side. That was my.
Oh,
family.
you know, if I had relatives that lived in the Confederacy, and I may, to the best of my knowledge, I don't, but if I did, I would honor them as my ancestors. But if they took up arms against my country, I would be the first to call them traitors. What's wrong with that? Why would you not want to love your relatives but not love their treasonous behavior?
I don't see how their treasonous behavior is a valid argument. It was not treasonous.
That treasonous behavior was on behalf. Hang on just a second, Marcus. That treasonous behavior was on behalf of the idea that white people should own black people. Now, you know, that's pretty reprehensible. But even worse is that there are still people today who are promoting that idea. Perhaps not, they're not coming right out and saying, yes, I think we should return to slavery. Although the fact of the matter is that over 1 million people in the United States are being held in slavery right now in our prison system. But setting that aside for a moment, they're not saying, yes, let's return to slavery. But they are saying that, we should have segregation, that we should have, that people of color should be limited in what they can do, in what schools they can go to, and all these other things. So I think you can draw a straight line from the times of slavery to today, and therefore it is relevant.
I want segregation. I don't want black people in our schools.
Yeah, Marcus, that you're a fool, an ass, a disgrace as an American. You are spitting, Marcus, in the face of people who have fought and died for this country for hundreds of years, or at least the ideals that they expressed or said that they embraced, even if they did it imperfectly or even badly or even not at all. That kind of rhetoric, Marcus, is what people who hate America say. That kind of rhetoric is the stuff that you hear out of the white supremacist fever swamps in Poland and Hungary. That kind of rhetoric is poison. That kind of rhetoric is the stuff that gets people killed and is getting people killed right now. We've had a number of white supremacists expressing the opinions that you just said, Marcus, kill people in the United States. Marcus, you're disgusting. Suzanne in New Lenox, Illinois. Hey, Suzanne, what's up?
Hi, I concur.
Thank you.
I'm calling because I really feel that the Republicans are using Antifa as their new Benghazi, and I don't like it.
Yep.
Because Antifa, like they say, is a movement. As in, Antifa stormed the beaches of Normandy and saved the world, right?
That's correct. It was the anti-fascist movement.
Right.
Was led, first by Churchill and then by Franklin Roosevelt.
Then they stormed the beaches of Normandy. They were heroes.
Right.
So people need to, take vitamins. Maybe their brains are just not evolved. And that's the other thing. I'm an evolver, and people need to evolve. And this is really sad to me that people are so hateful. And I'm a white person, and I'm afraid of the police. Pass that on. I'm afraid of them. So I don't know.
Our cops are out of control. I totally get it. And Suzanne, thank you. Okay. Well said. I appreciate the call.
Pass that on, the storming the beaches, because I think that's so cool. Thank you. Bye-bye.
You got it. Thank you, Suzanne. Mike in Munster, Indiana. Hey, Mike, what's up?
Hi, Tom. I always wanted to know, with Michael Flynn getting off today, what was all the information that he had? He had got a sweet plea deal to give information to the FBI. I'm not really sure what he ever told them. And what was he? I know he lied about talking to the Russian guy, Kislyak or something. But what were they discussing besides the sanctions? I know they were saying, hold off on the sanction thing until we get into power.
Well,
but there's something more than that.
That was it, and that's enough. To the best of my knowledge, that was it. And frankly, that's enough to say, because President Obama had just, as a result of very early FBI investigations into Russian interference in the election, Obama had just named and sanctioned a bunch of folks. He was president still. And Trump was concerned that if Russia reacted the way that they typically react to things like that, with a tit for tat, that he was going to come in as president in a situation where that was messier than he wanted, I guess would be the most charitable way to put it. And so Mike Flynn, what we don't know is whether Trump specifically ordered Flynn to do this or whether Flynn just, thought he would do it as a good guy. But basically what he said to Kislyak was, just hang on until we get into power and we'll make everything good. And
so we know all we need. We know all there is to know about Flynn. And it's not
well between that and his working on behalf of Erdogan in Turkey. Yeah, this is Mike Flynn is a traitor. I mean, he betrayed his country twice, and then he lied to the FBI about it.
Yeah, I was just wondering if there's more information redacted that hasn't come out yet.
There may well be, Mike, and I'm just unaware of it. But as far as I know, that's it. Mike, thanks for the call. Gary in Circle Pines, Minnesota. Hey, Gary, what's on your mind today?
Yeah, thanks for taking my call, Tom. I have a little bit of a worry about the future if win or lose with Donald Trump. Now, the Supreme Court right now, he's had some setbacks, not necessarily tremendous losses, but setbacks. Would he be in a position to be able to expand the Supreme Court before he leaves office, or would he have to win a second term to even consider doing something like that? Now, I know you wrote a book on the Supreme Court, and I haven't had a chance to read it yet. I'm still on your War on Voting book, but is it foolish for me to think that way?
No, it's you're onto something, Gary. There's just one piece of data that you need. The Constitution, Article 3, Section 2 of the Constitution says that Congress shall regulate the Supreme Court. And what that means is that Congress decides the budget of the Supreme Court. Congress decides when the Supreme Court will meet. Congress decides where the Supreme Court will meet. Congress provides the building. And Congress decides how many people are on the Supreme Court. And that number of people on the Supreme Court has been changed over the years, in some cases for political purposes. When Andrew Johnson became president after Lincoln was assassinated, shortly thereafter, one of the members of the Supreme Court died. And Congress got together and reduced the number of the Supreme Court. And I'm sorry, I don't remember the exact numbers now, but they reduced the number of members on the Supreme Court so that Andrew Johnson couldn't appoint a replacement. And then after Johnson left and Ulysses Grant became president, Congress got together and they expanded the Supreme Court back to where it was. So that was purely for political purposes, purely to block a president. But the president doesn't have the power to expand the court. It's only Congress. So that's the one piece of data that you're missing, Gary. And Congress right now, it ain't going to happen because it would have to originate in the House of Representatives, which is where all legislation has to start. And there's no way the Democrats are going to do that while Donald Trump is president if there's a 1% chance he might get reelected. Gary, thanks for the call and thanks for a very thoughtful question. We'll be right back.
You're listening to Thom Hartmann. Visit thomhartmann.com for audio and video archives.
The federal government is about to stop testing programs for COVID in Texas. This is mind-boggling. Stick around. And welcome back. Gina in, how do you say that town?
Conshohocken?
Conshohocken, Pennsylvania. Hey, Gina,
yes,
thanks for joining us.
They were going to make fun of you, but to let you try and say it.
Okay. Oh, so Joyce is up to no good there. Okay, Gina, what's on your mind?
I didn't mean to get her in trouble. She's so lovely.
That's okay. You didn't. She is wonderful. Yes.
Okay, may I ask my question then?
So, by all means.
Well, sir, I think your program is great, but I'm interested in your thoughts. I'm thinking at this point that all of the constructions on the left and the right, Democrat v. Republican, liberal v. conservative, progressive v. ultra-conservative, that those at this point, I believe, represent a closed-loop system that we actually can't win inside of, that those various arguments on either side are essentially meant to fit into each other and to present a lifetime back and forth as a distraction in all of these areas, including the areas of identity politics that you talked about with the gentleman earlier when you're talking about polarization, that ultimately what they spin out to do is to create eternal arguments amongst people because they're rooted in feelings, not facts. I've listened to your show today, and there are people who are rooted in their feelings and not facts. And we have actually cultivated that in the citizenry. So between the closed-loop system and what I'm looking at is kind of the socially constructed citizen, which is what each of us is. I'm feeling depressed, and I'm calling you to get your thoughts about that. I actually think that that the focus on all of the isms and obias that are plaguing us right now and always are intended to take our eyes off of the only thing that matters. And if we could all find a way through our polarization, by creating a new identity rather than a socially constructed individual, something just related in being human, that we will need to do something as revolutionary as that, because we've essentially been interacting with a lie, and that's why we can't make any progress. I hope that I haven't rambled. I'm deeply interested in your thoughts.
Gina, I think that what we're doing here with the left and right dichotomy in contemporary times is we're still debating the arguments that were laid out by Thomas Hobbes, John Locke, and Jean-Jacques Rousseau during the Enlightenment. Hobbes argued that the innate nature of humanity is violent and brutal, and that absent the iron fist of church and state, man would revert to his natural state. I'm using Hobbes's language here. And life would be nasty, brutish, and short. Locke and others, but in particular Locke and Rousseau, came along and said, no, that's not the case. The basic nature of humanity is not evil. The basic nature of humanity is nurturing and good. And
that the argument
so
has been used as a way of the day. That argument, as interested as I am, I wish I could talk to you forever about that dichotomy that exists that I think was initially...
Yeah, but unfortunately we can't, Gina, because we're out of time. I'm sorry. It's 10 minutes before the hour. I'll be right back. Hey, we're putting together a series of American history books. It started with the hidden history of guns and the Second Amendment. Then we had the hidden history of the Supreme Court, the betrayal of America. Then the hidden history of the Republican war on voting. Coming out soon is the hidden history of monopolies, how big business destroyed the American dream. And then next spring, it's going to be the hidden history of oligarchy and tyranny. So Gina just called and asked a question that I think is worth repeating, particularly given the caller that we had earlier who was basically saying that his racial identity, that his was, he was spouting his white supremacist nonsense. And her question was, is this left-right dichotomy, are the Republicans and Democrats, the liberals and conservatives, is this an argument that is merely basically designed to keep us occupied while we're being robbed blind? Now, that's not how she said it, but that's how I would say it. And typically, I think that when that argument is made, it's made in that context. And there's actually some truth to that argument, that at the surface level, some part of politics is about keeping us occupied, and certainly Donald Trump is the master of this, keeping us occupied while in the background the oligarchs are robbing us blind, poisoning our air and water for profit, ripping us off, destroying good jobs. The list goes on and on. But there's really a larger issue here, and I laid this out in a book I wrote years ago called Screwed. And I've touched on it in other books, and in fact, I believe that I'm touching on that in my book on oligarchy, or maybe in the Monopoly book. I remember writing it recently. And that is that the debate that we're having right now in America, and the debate that liberal democracies around the world are having, and frankly have been having since the American Revolution, is a debate that goes back to the 1630s, 1634 with the publication of Leviathan by Thomas Hobbes, 1674 or 75 with the publication of two treatises on government by John Locke, the 1680s and 1690s with the writings of Jean-Jacques Rousseau. And that sparked a movement in the 1600s that became an international movement, or at least a trans-European movement, in the 1700s that reached its peak in 1776 with the Declaration of Independence, a movement referred to as the Enlightenment. And the debate that went on around the Enlightenment was you had, on the one hand, what you would describe today as the conservative worldview that was best expressed by Thomas Hobbes in Leviathan, in which he said that without the iron fist of church or state, humanity will revert back to its natural state, and life will be, and there's that famous quote, life, there would be no arts, no letters, no means of motion, no travel, no society, and worst of all, life would be nasty, short, and brutish. And that's a terrible recitation of it. It's actually a very eloquent paragraph and much more lengthy than that. But in any case, you're familiar with the quote. And that was Hobbes' saying. And so conservatives believe that basically in our hearts, at our core, we are evil. And therefore, we have to have strong police. And we have to have basically brutal laws and brutal institutions of imprisonment, because people are fundamentally bad. And if you don't just beat the crap out of them from time to time, they're going to continue behaving badly. And out of
Today we're reading from Dorfman and Mallart's book, How to Read Donald Duck, Imperialist Ideology in the Disney Comic. And this is from the preface to the English edition. This book was first published in Spanish. To say that this book was burnt in Chile should not come as a surprise to anyone. Hundreds of books were destroyed and thousands more prohibited and censored. It was written in the middle of 1971, in the middle of the Chilean revolutionary process. Copper had been rescued, the land was being returned to the peasantry, the whole Chilean people were recovering the industries that during the 20th century had been the means of enrichment for Mr. Rockefeller, Grace, Guggenheim, and Morgan. Because this process was intolerable to the United States government and its multinational corporations, it had to be stopped. They organized a plan which at the time was suspected and since has been confirmed by Mr. Kissinger, Ford, and Colby to have been directed and financed by the United States intelligence services. Their objective was to overthrow the constitutional government of Chile. To realize their objective, an invisible blockade was imposed. Credits were denied, spare parts purchased for industrial machinery were not sent, and later the Chilean state bank accounts in the U.S. were blocked, and an embargo preventing the sale of Chilean copper throughout the world was organized. There were, however, two items which were not blocked: planes, tanks, ships, and technical assistance for the Chilean armed forces, and magazines, TV serials, advertising, and public opinion polls for the Chilean mass media, which continued for the most part to be in the hands of a small group which was losing its privileges. To maintain them with those of the U.S., their media prepared the climate for the bourgeois insurrection, which finally materialized some years later on the 11th of September, 1973. Each day, with expert U.S. advice, in each newspaper, each weekly, each monthly magazine, each news dispatch, each movie, and each comic book, their arsenal of psychological warfare was fortified. In the words of General Pinochet, the point was, quote, to conquer the minds, end quote, while in the words of Donald Duck in the magazine Dislandia, published in December 1971, coinciding with the first mass rallies of native fascism, the so-called March of the Empty Pots and Pans, the point was to, quote, restore the king. But the people did not want the restoration of the king, nor of the businessman. The popular Chilean cultural offensive, which accompanied the social and economic liberation, took multiple forms: wall paintings, popular papers, TV programs, motion pictures, theater, songs, literature. In all areas of human activity, with differing degrees of intensity, the people expressed their will. Perhaps the most important arm of this offensive was the work of the state publishing house, Quimantu, a word meaning sunshine of knowledge in the language of the Chilean Machupe Indians. In 2.5 years, it published 5 million books, twice the amount that had been published in all of Chile during the previous 70 years. In addition, it transformed the content of some of the magazines it had inherited from before the Popular Unity government and created new ones. It is in this multifaceted context, with the people on the march to cultural liberation, a process which also meant criticizing the mass cultural merchandise exported so profitably by the U.S. into the Third World, that How to Read Donald Duck was generated. We simply answered a practical need. It was not an academic exercise. For the Mad Dog Warriors on that September 11th, there were no paintings on the walls. There were only enormous stains which dirtied the city in memory. They, using the fascist youth brigades, whitewashed all the signing, many-colored walls of the nation. They broke records, murdered singers, destroyed radios and printing presses, imprisoned and executed journalists, so that nothing would be left to remind anybody of anything about the struggle for national liberation. But it was not enough to clean these cultural stains from the street. The most important task was to eliminate all those who bore the stain inside themselves: the fighters, workers, peasants, employees, students, and patriotic soldiers, to eliminate these creators of a new life, to eliminate this new life which grew, and for all that we created. This book, conceived for the Chilean people and our urgent needs, produced in the midst of our struggle, is now being published far from Chile in the uncle land of Disney, behind the barbed wire network of ITT. Mr. Disney, we are returning your duck, feathers plucked and well roasted. Look inside, you can see the handwriting on the wall, our hands still writing on the wall, Donald, to go home. This is written in 1975. And then this from David Kunzel's introduction. The names of the presidents change. That of Disney remains. 46 years after the birth of Mickey Mouse, 8 years after the death of his master, Disney's may be the most widely known North American name in the world. He is arguably the century's most important figure in bourgeois popular culture. He has done more than any single person to disseminate around the world certain myths upon which that culture has thrived, notably that of an innocence supposedly universal, beyond place, beyond time, and beyond criticism. The myth of U.S. political innocence is at last being dismantled, and the reality which it masks lies in significant areas exposed to public view. But the great American dream of cultural innocence still holds a global imagination in thrall. The first major breach into the Disney of this dream was made by Richard Schickel's The Disney Version, The Lifetimes and Commerce of Walt Disney, the book How to Read Donald Duck.
This is the Thom Hartmann Program.
So, did you ever hear of perchlorate? It is a compound that is used in the production of rocket fuel, among other things. It was used back in the day. They discovered back in the, I believe it was in the 30s or 40s, that this stuff killed off the thyroid. And so when people had hyperthyroidism, which is too much thyroid, their thyroid is too active, they would use it to basically burn away part of the thyroid. Then they discovered that it had just really radical side effects and was not a good thing to be giving to people. But it has gotten into our drinking water, and this is a major problem. Danielle Melgar is with us, the Toxics Program Advocate for the U.S. Public Interest Research Groups. USPIRG.org is the website. And Danielle, welcome to the program. Tell us about, first of all, perchlorate, if I'm pronouncing it correctly or not. Do correct me if I'm wrong. And, what it is and why we should worry about it in our drinking water.
Of course. Yeah, and thank you for having me. I'm excited to be here. So like you said, perchlorate is a chemical that has ended up in our drinking water. It is used in things like rocket fuel, fireworks, matches, and fertilizers. And it just gets into our drinking water in the manufacturing process.
So what are the downsides? What are the consequences to Americans of having perchlorate in our water?
Yeah. So when we come into contact with perchlorate, like you said, it can disrupt thyroid function, which can lead to hypothyroidism. So that's the opposite of the condition you mentioned. The thyroid gland cannot produce enough thyroid hormone. And like you said, that's indisputable. Perchlorate has been used to treat hyperthyroidism, so we know that it has that effect. And that treatment was discontinued because it resulted in side effects up to and including death. And then beyond that, in children, the thyroid plays a role in healthy neurological development. So it has also been linked to loss of IQ points in children.
Wow. So we've got perchlorate in our water. I recall years ago reading about a compound that was super hydrophilic. It loved water, that if you got even a small amount of it into an aquifer, for example, it would very rapidly distribute itself throughout the entire aquifer. My recollection is that was perchlorate. Am I remembering wrong?
I can't speak to that because I'm relatively new to working on the issue of perchlorate. Yeah, so I just can't comment on whether that was the same chemical.
So at these concentrations, and by the way, I probably another data point that we should put in here. I'm assuming that this is still the case. This was a number of a couple of decades ago when a member of my family went on long-term thyroid medication because her thyroid wasn't working as it should. And, we were looking this up and discovered that the most widely prescribed medication in the United States right now is Synthroid, Levothroid, Armor, these brand names for products that basically, replace missing thyroid hormone as a consequence of damage to the thyroid or hypothyroidism of unknown etiology. Does perchlorate in our water and decades and decades of perchlorate in our water have something to do with this national epidemic of hypothyroidism?
Yeah, so, since I'm not a doctor, I can't comment on all of the possible causes for different types of thyroid disorders. But, we know there are a wide variety of sources of this problem. And of course, perchlorate is, one of those potential
is in that
causes.
list. Yeah, I know there's some people were speculating that it was radioactive iodine from the nuclear tests and the above ground nuclear tests in the 50s too. So the Environmental Protection Agency should regulate this. What's the story? When do they start? Where are they at right now?
So back in the 90s, perchlorate was found in high concentrations throughout the southwest of the United States. And in the absence of a federal response, states like California and Massachusetts stepped up to enact their own standards. But the EPA still has not done that. And they have decided that under the Safe Drinking Water Act, they don't need to regulate perchlorate. And the reasoning for that is that, first, they say that perchlorate no longer appears in high enough levels to cause health problems. And second, they say it doesn't appear in enough states' drinking water to be worth regulating at the federal level. But the problem with that reasoning is that, the reason that they're saying that is that states like California and Massachusetts have taken matters into their own hands. So essentially their reasoning is that their job is done because states have done their job for them. And of course, this leaves Americans who don't live in those states still at risk of exposure.
First of all, was there a, like with hydrofluorocarbons, we banned their production. Is there a ban for the production of perchlorate in effect, or does American industry still make it and use it?
American industry still makes it and uses it. The recent EPA decision is only about the incidence of perchlorate in our drinking water, but it does nothing to actually, turn off the tap and stop perchlorate production in order to, then eventually stop it getting into our environment.
So do we know if it's overrepresented in the water supplies of states that don't regulate it?
So in the states that don't regulate it, there are certain states that are definitely more impacted than others. In some states, there doesn't seem to be strong evidence that it's, a major concern in their drinking water. But in others, it definitely is, and we're seeing those elevated levels.
Right. It's remarkable stuff. And so what is the USPIRG.org? What are you all calling for?
Yeah, so this particular decision by the EPA is a final ruling. So, there's not really room under this EPA to kind of reverse this decision. We are, obviously opposed to this decision, and in the future, under a different EPA, would push to reverse the decision and start to regulate perchlorate in drinking water. Like I said, we don't expect that to happen under this EPA. So we are actually focused on, many other toxic chemicals, of which perchlorate is just one. We have just had to focus elsewhere for the time being.
Yeah. Do you think that if, God willing, we get and I realize you're not a political organization. In fact, let me not use political words, that we get a new administration and a new Congress who actually are concerned about the health and welfare of American citizens, that perchlorate will come back up, that the EPA will consider regulating this?
So the EPA EPA has in the past considered it. Under the Obama administration, that was something under consideration. So I think certainly there is a possibility that a future EPA that, like you said, is more invested in protecting our health and environment would, entertain proposals to regulate perchlorate.
Is there a perchlorate lobby?
You mean, is there a specific trade organization?
Is there some industry
so to speak,
group that is, that's fighting to keep it from being regulated?
I do not actually have a good answer to that, or about perchlorate specifically. Certainly there are organizations like the American Chemistry Council that will tend to lobby on topics like this.
Yeah, got it. Danielle Melgar with the U.S. Public Interest Research Group's uspirg.org. Danielle, thank you so much for dropping by.
Thank you for having me.
My pleasure.
This is the Thom Hartmann Program.
We'll be back with more of the news of the day and your calls and how your school may affect your politics. Yeah, your experiences as a kid. Check this out. We'll be right back. And welcome back. Barry in Bellingham, Washington. Hey, Barry, what's on your mind today?
Hi, Tom. Nice talking to you. I wanted to make an observation. I've often heard you talk about how Mark Zuckerberg has been putting all this ultra-right-wing propaganda on Facebook. I've been on Facebook for over 10 years, and I just do not get that stuff. On the contrary, I've been getting, if there's any political stuff from people or groups other than my friends, it's on the left, I guess.
It's left-wing stuff.
Move On, or the other 98%, or messages from Elizabeth Warren or Rachel Maddow, all the people or groups that I like. And I have a theory about it. I'm thinking that Facebook eavesdrops on their users, and they've been, observing my political comments or my responses to other political comments, and they figured, hey, let's not waste time with this guy. He's a Democrat. And maybe to keep my clientele, they put on things that I would like. Anyhow,
you have identified their business model, Barry, and it's very simple. If you have liked, and I mean that in the context of clicking the like button. If you have liked posts in the past that suggest, or if you have posted things for that matter, that suggest that your politics are progressive or left-leaning or democratic, then, when you come to Facebook as an advertiser and you say, I want to reach people who are persuadable on these particular issues, they will say, well, this guy, Barry's not persuadable. He's a hardcore lefty, so you're not going to want to, give him a sales pitch about climate change. In fact, it might blow up. He might publicize the fact that you're doing it. But Ralph over here, Ralph has, liked things on both left and right, or Ralph has expressed cynicism about politics. So pitch it to Ralph. And you can buy super, super, super fine-tuned lists of people, essentially, on Facebook. You can buy a list of people who are men between the ages of 20 and 28 who own a motorcycle and, and who have visited another state in the last year and who have children. I mean, it's like there's literally thousands of criteria that have been applied to every single one of us. We all exist in all these various boxes. And then people come to Facebook and say, I want to reach people, which boxes can you give to me? What boxes can you deliver to me? And that's how Facebook does it. And it's very sophisticated. I mean, this is what Cambridge Analytica was all about when they were doing all that work for the Trump campaign in 2016, was going to Facebook. In fact, they didn't even have to go to Facebook in some cases because they had this app that was sucking down Facebook's own data. And so they knew who the people on the right and left were and who the persuadables were and who the non-persuadables were and all that kind of stuff. So, Barry, what you have identified is the Facebook business model. And so for lefties, Facebook seems like a nice, friendly left-wing place. But the reality is that for teenagers, for people who haven't expressed strong political opinions, they're going to be getting the right-wing stuff, and they're going to be getting the opposition to climate change stuff, and they're going to be getting it fast and furious. Barry, thank you for the call and the question, and for watching us on Free Speech TV. We'll be right back. Coming up on 20 minutes past the hour here on the Thom Hartmann Program, helping you win the water cooler wars if we're ever back again to the water cooler. Stick around. Our 1 hour free podcast recaps our show, and it's available wherever fine podcasts are found. And we have the full 3 hour podcast available over at thomhartmann.com if you want to really support our program. So we've got a new video of over at thomhartmann.com for people who support our program. It's about private equity firms. You know, Mitt Romney's company, Bain Capital, and Steve Schwartzman's Blackstone, and some of these private equity groups have long been considered risky investments. I mean, you know, billionaires put money into these things, but and sometimes they produce really high returns, but they also have huge fees, and they operate kind of like a black box. There's all kinds of hidden stuff. And what they have been salivating about for years, Schwartzman talked about this just a few days after Donald Trump was inaugurated, was they wanted to get their hands on people's 401ks and IRAs, people's retirement money, their pension funds. And it's been illegal. And Trump and Eugene Scalia, the head of the Labor Department, just legalized this practice. The consequences could be dramatic. The video's over at thomhartmann.com. Okay, I promised I would share this with you. This is in part in response to the caller earlier who was basically calling for, you know, resegregation or an ongoing segregation of our society. We're, in some ways, we're more segregated now than we were in the 1950s. In most ways, we're not. But in some states, our schools, frankly, are. But in any case, this new study, and tip of the hat to David Sirota, who published this on June 22nd. New study by researchers at the University of Colorado, Dartmouth, and Carnegie Mellon University, 3 different universities, found that if a white student, now we're looking at college students now, if white college students had gone to elementary and middle school, they were specifically looking at the schools in the Charlotte-Mecklenburg area, if they had gone to elementary schools or middle schools with even 1 or 2 black kids, these white kids were 10% less likely to be Republicans. And, you know, as our caller earlier pointed out, you know, people say, oh, I'm all about being a Republican and I'm a conservative and liberals are terrible. And, you know, and when you ask them, okay, what's the real issue here that you're concerned about? It's their white privilege. It's white power. It's white supremacy. It's segregation. I mean, let's just tell the truth about this. You know, the Louis Gohmertization of the Republican Party. Louis Gohmert, by the way, this morning was banging his desk constantly while this guy was giving his testimony about how Bill Barr is politicizing the Justice Department. It's obscene. Anyhow, Travis in Centerville, Virginia. Travis, you wanted to speak to us?
How's it going, Tom? Hey. I'm just responding to that racist guy. I forgot his name earlier. I had 15 ancestors who fought in the Civil War. 10 fought for the South, 5 fought for the North. My great-great-grandfather was an XO to Mosby. Now, I'm not sure if you're familiar with who Mosby is, but Mosby's Raiders who operated in, they were a guerrilla unit that operated in Northern Virginia. And they
Confederates?
would do, yes. Mm-hmm. And his revolver is locked in the display case up the road from my house where I live now. And I didn't know that until like a few years ago. There was like a Centerville fair and I found it. I don't honor my Confederate ancestors. I don't hate them. I think they're idiots, but I don't carry the Confederate flag. I'm literally the grandchild of the Confederacy, and I don't see no need to carry a Confederate flag.
Well, and it's not even the Confederate flag. It was the battle flag of the rebellion. But yeah, I get it. I totally get it. And you know, in our family, I know, you know, my mom had thought for years that one of our ancestors was James Madison. When she dug into it, she found that it wasn't. So that was like, okay, that's one slave owner I can check off the list that I'm not descended from. But she did find this one guy in Kentucky who every year would buy a slave. I don't recall if he did it in Kentucky or if he went south to do it, but and she was horrified. This was when I was a kid, and because she was like real into genealogy, you know, and the whole, and she was not a Mormon, but she was using a lot of the Mormon resources because they're very into this. And what she discovered was that he was buying people out of slavery so he could free them. He was transporting them up to Michigan and saying, you know, have fun. And that was his life's work. So I felt a little better, but, you know, I also wrote a book about Thomas Jefferson, you know, who was a slaveholder. I'm not talking so much about Thomas Jefferson anymore. And I'm, you know, in fact, I just wrote a book on tyranny, and there were dozens of Jefferson quotes that would have been great in there. There aren't any. I think that it's time for us to say, and including myself, that let's quote the enslaved, not the slavers, not the slaveholders. Let's recognize this moment, this transitional moment, and be with that transition. It'll make a healthier society rather than try to hang on to you know, these barbarous institutions of racism and slavery and the Confederate Rebellion.
And I think one more thing, that racist guy was trying to clue in that he didn't want other people of different colors here. I mean, that's what he was saying. He was mentioning MS-13. The thing is, even us, quote-unquote, white people, half our ancestors weren't considered white. So the Irish, my ancestry, weren't considered white at one time. The German weren't considered white at one time. Franklin read about Germans and that they're subhuman. So even British, Anglo-Saxons, that's not one ethnic group. That's two. That's two.
Right.
England became the British Empire was mixed between Anglo-Saxons and Jutes. Jutes, French, Germans, they were multi-ethnic. So there's never been a society.
And they all hated each other for a while.
They were.
Yeah, this thing of, you know, this is my group, that's your group, and we're different, and we're going to hate each other. This goes back a long, long way, and it just, you know, using race as the tool for this is just laziness. I mean, if you're going to hate somebody, at least hate them for their philosophy or something. It's like, you know, saying, oh, you just look different. That's the cheapest, laziest kind of. Anyhow, Travis, thanks for the call.
And thank you for your program. Call 202-808-9925.
We'll be back with more of your calls right after this. It's 28 minutes past the hour of the Thom Hartmann Program. Speaking the truth, some multinational corporations would really rather you didn't know all about.
Our book today in the Thom Hartmann Book Club is by Ruth Marcus. Supreme Ambition, Brett Kavanaugh and the Conservative Takeover. This is from the prologue. Supreme Court Justice Anthony Kennedy had a request. Would President Trump have a few minutes to speak privately? It was April 10th, 2017, a sparkling spring morning in Washington, and Kennedy was at the White House to preside over the ceremonial swearing in of the newest Supreme Court Justice, Neil Gorsuch. First time in history that a sitting justice had sworn in one of his former law clerks to join him on the bench. Just 80 days into Trump's chaotic presidency, the confirmation of Gorsuch represented a rare and welcome victory for the beleaguered new administration, reeling from court defeats of its travel ban and, despite controlling both houses of Congress, unable to repeal President Obama's signature health care law. Perhaps most important, as the prominent conservative lawyers, activists, and judges assembled in the Rose Garden that day understood, Gorsuch's addition was just one step, necessary but not sufficient, in the 3 decades-long conservative bid to cement control over the high court. This effort had been as frustrating as it was lengthy. Seeming opportunities for dominance repeatedly slipped away, with Republican nominees, including Kennedy himself, turning out to be less reliably conservative than advertised. But Republicans have learned from these costly errors, assembling a farm team of potential nominees whose judicial records could be carefully scrutinized to detect any risk of ideological deviation. Gorsuch was among those who came bearing the seal of approval of the Federalist Society, the conservative legal group that had made itself the central actor in this court-shaping exercise and was playing an even more outsized role in the new administration. Trump took pains to single out one man who was not in the Rose Garden that day, Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell, for all he did to make this achievement possible, quoting Trump. Indeed, everyone present knew that McConnell had been the indispensable man leading to that moment. Had it not been for McConnell, President Obama would have filled the vacancy created by Justice Antonin Scalia's sudden death in February 2016, and Justice Merrick Garland would be sitting on the high court, anchoring a newly fortified liberal majority. McConnell, with his audacious announcement that the opening would not be filled, no matter that Obama had 11 months remaining in his term, had avoided that fateful outcome. His intervention meant that Gorsuch now occupied Scalia's seat, a conservative for conservative swap. The next vacancy was almost certain to be the far more critical one, shifting the court's balance instead of affirming it. On that score, all eyes were on the 80-year-old Kennedy, then serving his 30th year on the high court, and by dint of age, years of service, and political allegiance, the most likely to depart. The swing justice on an already conservative court, Kennedy was pleased about Gorsuch, but he had another former law clerk in mind as he was ushered into Trump's private dining room for an unusual session with the president and White House counsel Don McGahn. Justices are routinely invited to the White House for social events, state dinners, and holiday parties, but at least until Trump took office, such one-on-one meetings were rare in the modern era. With its finicky notions about preserving the appearance of judicial independence, unlike the relaxed days when justices did double duty as private counselors to presidents such as Franklin Roosevelt and Lyndon Johnson. In the chronically leaky Trump White House, aides took pains to keep the Trump-Kennedy meetings secret. There were no public reports about the session, and only a few senior officials ever learned what Kennedy said to Trump that day. The justice's message to the president was as consequential as it was straightforward, and it was a remarkable insertion by a sitting justice into the distinctly presidential act of judge picking. As a candidate, Trump had upended tradition by issuing a list of judges. It ultimately grew to 21, including Gorsuch, from which he pledged to pick his Supreme Court nominees. Now Kennedy had a recommendation for Trump's list. "You named one of my former clerks," Kennedy told Trump. "You should think about another one, Brett Kavanaugh." When Anthony Kennedy spoke, the Trump White House listened, with good reason. During the campaign, when Trump, against all expectations, emerged as the Republican nominee and ultimate victor over Hillary Clinton, the issue of judicial selection had been a utilitarian means to an electoral end. The socially conservative and evangelical voters Trump needed to win were deeply, understandably suspicious of the thrice-married, once Democratic New Yorker. They were particularly dubious about how Trump would approach the critical task of shaping the federal judiciary, especially the Supreme Court. The list of high court candidates that Trump produced with the help of the Federalist Society, upending convention with typical Trumpian bravado, was explicitly aimed at calming their concerns, and it succeeded beyond the wildest expectations of its creators. On Election Day, more than a quarter of Trump voters identified the Supreme Court as the critical factor in determining their vote. White, evangelical, born-again Christians broke 81% for Trump to 16% for Hillary Clinton, meaning that Trump outperformed previous Republican nominees Mitt Romney, John McCain, and George W. Bush among such voters. In office, Trump not only keenly understood the politics of judicial selection and its importance for his reelection, he also gained a new appreciation for what the Supreme Court meant to a president's legacy. Thanks to McConnell's ruthlessness, Trump had inherited what no president had before, the gift of an existing vacancy. Supreme Ambition by Ruth Marcus.
This week on The Science Revolution, about that happiness. Is it time to stop being so careful? Is spontaneity the key to happiness? Professor Janice Brainy is here on plastic rain pouring down in our national parks and everywhere. Tony Corbo with Food and Water Watch drops by to warn Americans the USDA is trying to outsource chicken processing to China and what that means. Tune in wherever you find fine podcasts. Hey, we have a new video over at ThomHartmann.com for people who are supporters of our program. It is the 12 steps. Common Cause actually put these together, but I boiled them down into a nice little rant on a YouTube video that you can share with friends and neighbors and acquaintances who might be wondering, how did this coronavirus thing get so bad? Why is it that the United States has a third of the deaths in the world? Why do we have over 100,000 dead people and South Korea has 200 and Taiwan has like 70 and Australia has fewer than 100 and has pretty much squashed the virus? Why is it that only 7 people died in New Zealand? Why are so many other countries doing so well and we're not? Well, there's an answer to that question, and I lay it out in this little video. It's over at ThomHartmann.com, and you can grab it there and share it with your friends. And I'll give you a clue. Almost all of it has to do with things that orange guy in the White House either did or failed to do, but it's a great list. You can check it out at ThomHartmann.com. Welcome back. 35 minutes past the hour. I mentioned this earlier, but I didn't fill in the details. I think I mentioned it as we were just hitting a break. The Trump administration, Josh Kravensky, reporting over a Talking Points memo. The Trump administration is ending funding and support for local COVID-19 testing sites around the country over the course of the next week. That's it. No more. Sorry. Texas, Josh notes, will be particularly hard hit by this decision. In Dallas County, Texas, the federal government will end support on June 30th for the 2 testing sites it has been supporting since March. Rocky Vaz confirmed to TPM. He's the director of emergency management. The city of Dallas asked the federal government for an extension beyond June 30th, but the Trump administration said, no, sorry, you guys are on your own. Donald Trump asked us to slow down the testing, so we're going to slow down the testing. Seriously. It's happening. You heard it here. John in Rochester, Minnesota. Hey, or Joan, Joan, what's on your mind today?
Well, Tom, I wanted to talk to you about the elephant in the room. We have court cases of, police and blacks and other people. And the persons that are responsible are the everyday people of this country, the men and women, all of the citizens. And they have, I'm sure, a fear of reprisal or retribution or a lot of flack from neighbors and friends if they don't go along with what happens all the time. The police are let free, and the other man is found guilty. And I think there should be a better system in this country in these cases because there's so much discrimination. I think either the decision should be up to the judge, or there should be a new group formed with the police in charge of their own selves, where they can clean out their nest and get rid of, any hate group people or the bad eggs, and have a division that they can be proud of. And we need to do something about it because it's just a terrible travesty to see some people go free that shouldn't, and see some people go to prison that shouldn't. And as far as the George Floyd case, why didn't a person just go up and knock on his car door window and ask him to move his car? It would have saved a life and saved a lot of heartbreak in this country. So I don't know.
Yeah, you're talking about Mr. Brooks, but yes. Yeah, no, I get what you're saying, Joan, and you have more faith in judges and police departments than I do. My experience suggests that juries are actually a good thing, although the jury system has been used in a very, very racist way, particularly in the South for years and years, and that you can't trust a police department to reform itself. You just can't. And I think that there's an overwhelming amount of evidence to that effect. But let me just toss one other thing in here before I pick up the next call. The Voting Rights Act was gutted by John Roberts, who claimed in 2013 in the Shelby County case that there is no more racism in America. He, honest to God, said words to that effect. And the proof in his mind was the fact that a black man was in the White House. And so, therefore, the southern states that have historically enforced their laws having to do with who can vote and who can't, and their systems about who finds it easy to vote and who finds it hard to vote, that federal oversight can end now. That was in 2013. 24 hours later, you had states like South Carolina and Georgia shutting down polling places in black neighborhoods. 24 hours later, purging people off voting lists. Millions of people, black people by and large, off voting lists. So, there are a lot of us who are saying, wouldn't it be a good thing to repass the Voting Rights Act? The Voting Rights Act was passed, originally back in the 1960s. It was passed by, I believe it was passed in a way that requires, by reconciliation, a way that requires periodic, or every 10 years, needs to be repassed. It had most recently been, prior to the Shelby County decision, within the previous 10 years, it had been ratified by the Senate unanimously. And John Roberts said, well, the reason for that is because there's a bunch of senators who don't want to be called racists. Again, honest to God, you can read the decision. Well, obviously, gutting the Voting Rights Act was a huge mistake, and we need the Voting Rights Act back. And 200 days ago, Democrats introduced it into the United States Senate and said to Mitch McConnell, please allow us to have a debate and a vote. This was passed unanimously back in 2003 during the Bush administration, and we would like a chance to revisit this. Actually, I'm not sure if it was 2003, whatever the year was. And Mitch McConnell has said, no, not going to happen. Meanwhile, Donald Trump has appointed, and the Senate has confirmed, 200 judges, the mini Supreme Court judges, the U.S. district courts all across the United States. More judges than any president in the history of the United States, because McConnell, for the last three years of the Obama administration, refused basically to appoint any judges, to the point that John Roberts wrote a letter to Mitch McConnell in the Senate back in the last year of the Obama administration saying this is a crisis for the federal judiciary, that you're not allowing new judges to be appointed. McConnell was like, tough luck. So, most recently, in fact, the very last nominee was just, another one of these white conservative guys with very sketchy racial records. Not a single black judge nominated or appointed. Virtually all men. Virtually all white. 0 black judges. And this is where we're at. And Mitch McConnell will not even allow a conversation about the Voting Rights Act. If you would like to lean on your Republican senator about this, the number for the United States Senate for Capitol Hill is 202-225-3121. And just call up and say, hey, I'd like to speak to my senator. If you're calling from Utah, I'd like to speak to Mitt Romney. If you're calling from, fill in the blank, right? So anyhow, there's your issue for the day. Kathy in Running Springs, California. Hey, Kathy, what's up?
Hi.
Hey.
Oh, hi. Sorry, thank you for taking my call. This is amazing. I've never gotten through before. A lot of the topics have really been on my mind that have been presented today. It's been an amazing show. I'm kind of going back to I need to go on your site and look at the COVID information, because you're probably already familiar with Dan Benbow. He's a blogger.
I'm not.
He has presented, every now and then I have the emails from Ross Story. And about a month ago, I just came across this one. It says Anatomy of a Man-Made Disaster. 320 ways Donald Trump failed to protect us from the coronavirus. Now, this
I saw that story. Yeah.
It's
yeah, I saw
amazing.
that.
Detailed timeline interconnects all the mess ups of this administration. It's just amazing.
Yeah.
But I do definitely want to check out your site also.
Yeah.
But
Well, I
just
don't think we have any COVID information over on our site. It's mostly just basically about our radio show. Although, if you want to find all the articles that I've written in the last few years, and there are some about COVID there, go to hartmannreport.com. But Kathy, I think that what's going on, and I mentioned this earlier in the program, is that Republicans are figuring it out. They don't want to die. And Donald Trump is like the candidate of death. He's like the angel of death.
It's incredible how intersected all this stuff that's been going on is. The mess up.
It really is. It really is. Kathy, thank you for the call. And I agree with you. Raw Story has become kind of the drudge of the left. They update their stories really quickly. They're doing a great job over there. They periodically publish my stuff too. So I suppose I have a vested interest in that, but maybe not. I don't know. But in any case, Kathy, thank you for the call. We'll be right back. It's 45 minutes past the hour.
You're listening to Thom Hartmann. Visit thomhartmann.com for audio and video archives.
Back with more of your calls in just a moment. Stick around. And welcome back. John in Apple Valley, California. Hey, John, what's on your mind? Thanks for waiting on hold.
Can you hear me, Tom?
Just fine.
Oh, okay. A lot of things, just like the lady that was on before, a lot of thoughts, but I'm limited to one, and so this is the one. I remember, and you're the historian, this is a history question. I remember when I was a young man, Carter was president, that the home loan interest rates were like 15, 17%. It was really outrageous. And I'm just wondering if
we had a 13% mortgage during those years.
Well, but I'm just wondering if the banks were part of the reason and the way they ravaged the economy with that, or the home buying anyway, real estate business, if that was part also of the fall of Mr. Carter, President Carter. I mean, if the banks were in on it, and that's why they did it. That's kind of my thought. I don't know, and that's why I'm asking you, the historian.
Sure. Yeah. No, that was not the case. What had happened was, let me just back up and give you an abstract lesson or story about how inflation happens. Inflation, which is the debasement of currency, the reduction in value of a currency, happens from one of two reasons, typically. Either one, the government produces more currency than there is need for the currency, so they flood the market with that currency, and the value of every dollar goes down because there's more dollars in circulation. That has never happened in the United States. But that's by and large what happened in Germany after World War I with the hyperinflation. And you could argue that's what happened in Zimbabwe. But the second thing that causes hyperinflation, that also was the major contributor actually to the German hyperinflation, is if a commodity which is absolutely essential to the functioning of an economy becomes very, very scarce, the price of that commodity explodes, and therefore that explosion in price of that one commodity echoes through the rest of the economy, driving up prices. And that happened in Germany with regard to food after World War I. There was actually a mini famine, and that happened in the United States with regard to oil in the early 70s as a result of two Arab oil embargoes. And so what happened was the price of oil exploded in the United States. In fact, it more than quadrupled in 1 year. And that then, because almost everything is made out of oil, even our food is made out of oil, because oil, they make fertilizer out of oil. Oil fuels the machines that we use to tractors and things. It gets our food to us, by trucks and things. Oil affects everything. And so that radical increase in the price of oil as a result of the Arab oil embargo drove inflation in the United States. So to reduce inflation, the chairman of the Fed said, we need to slow the economy down. We need to induce a mini recession, which will produce deflation. It'll reduce prices and increase the value of the dollar. And so he raised interest rates in order to slow down the economy. And that's what was going on. The rise in interest rates throughout the late 70s was purely done by the Fed, and it was purely done to try to slow down the economy so that we didn't tip into a worse inflationary spiral. There are people who argue that that was not the proper remedy, or that it shouldn't have been done that way, or it should have been done more slowly, and that hurt Carter, and it's one of the reasons Reagan won. But the bottom line is that's why it happened. John, thanks for the call. We'll be right back. Hey, we're putting together a series of American history books. It started with a hidden history of guns and the Second Amendment. Then we had the hidden history of the Supreme Court, the betrayal of America. Then the hidden history of the Republican war on voting. Coming out soon is the hidden history of monopolies, how big business destroyed the American dream. And then next spring, it's going to be the hidden history of oligarchy and tyranny. Hey, we have a brand new video up at thomhartmann.com for the people who are subscribers or supporters to our program. And this one's about national health insurance and why and how we really need a single-payer national health care system, whether you call it Medicare for all, or you call it single-payer, or you call it whatever. Medicare for all, it has a lot of appeal because, generally speaking, Medicare is positively viewed. That's what they call it in Canada. It's called Medicare. And, which makes sense, care for people using medicine. We would save at least $150 billion a year just on billing. You've got hospitals in the United States that have entire floors devoted to billing. Hospitals in Canada have one desk with, one or two people sitting at that desk, handling the billing. It's just crazy. And people would get better care. They get more comprehensive care. Our entire nation gets healthier. And there's a whole bunch of essentially bullet points to build this argument for Medicare for all over at thomhartmann.com. You can check it out right now. And welcome back. Thom Hartmann here with you. Adam in Youngstown, Ohio. Hey, Adam, what's on your mind?
Hey, Tom. I got a question that dates back to basically the beginning of your show. You were talking about let's say Flynn and Roger Stone, and then you've got people like Michael Cohen as well. But I started really getting into politics around the Bush-Cheney time, whenever they were ruining America. And it seemed like with the Republicans in charge, whenever it's a Republican presidency and administration, and this may go back to Nixon, there seems to be like an inner circle. Like for Bush and Cheney, it was those two, and then it was Condoleezza Rice and Donald Rumsfeld. But outside of that circle, you had people like Scooter Libby and John Yoo and that idiot from Blackwater. And there's a lot of indictments, and there's a lot of people going to prison. I guess during Reagan's 2 terms, there were 188 people that were either
more people went to prison for corruption during the Reagan administration than any administration in the history of the United States.
Yeah, and it seems like this goes all the way back to Nixon. It may go back further than that. But is that the way it always seems to be? It seems like a reoccurring theme. And the last time I remember what I remember from Obama is just Fox News trying to convince everybody that Shirley Sherrod is a racist and Eric Holder is evil. And there's no indictments. Right. But every time we have a Republican presidency, there just seems to be like this group of untouchables that nothing's going to happen to them. And then you've got people outside of that fold that are trying to get into that room, and they end up the John Yoos, the Scooter Libby's, the Michael Cohens.
Yeah. Well, they were semi-insiders. But, what's going on here, Adam, and it's fairly easy to identify. In fact, Rachel Maddow's producer, Steve Bannon, was on the show earlier.
I heard that interview
this week or late last week. Yeah, and he wrote a book about this. This is not his take, though. This is my take, and I haven't read his book, so it may differ from his perspective. But basically, I think that prior to 1965 or 64, the principal difference between the Democratic and Republican parties was the differences were relatively small. Harry Truman and Franklin Roosevelt We're very much the party of labor. And the Republican Party was very much the party of business, but they were the party of Main Street business, of the dry cleaners down the street business. The cloth coat Republicans is how they were referred to. How Richard Nixon, talking about his wife Pat and the coat she had. She owns a good cloth coat. The Checkers speech. And so what happened in 64, 65. Was leveraging the death of John Kennedy. Lyndon Johnson got passed the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act. And the Democratic Party rejected racism as a governing principle. The Republican Party then rushed in to embrace racism.
From the Dixiecrats over to the other side?
That's correct. The Dixiecrats, okay. Strom Thurmond, these Dixiecrats, they all became Republicans in the 60s, in the late 60s, early 70s. And so, number one, the Republican Party became basically the official party of racism. And number two, they, in the process, basically abandoned any governing principles. They ceased in the 60s, and the Nixon presidency was the first example of this, ceased to be a governing party that had any core philosophical beliefs that were positive beliefs. Their beliefs were all basically, we're here for the rich people, we are the rich people, we're here for money and power, period, full stop. And the Democrats were still saying, we're the party for the people, we're still the party of labor, we're the party of pluralistic societies and things like that.
And they're still willing to govern.
And, yeah, absolutely, because they can get more money and power by governing, the Republicans. And the Democrats are still talking about what's best for America and what's best for the people. And it's basically been that way since 1968, since the Nixon presidency. You're absolutely right, Adam, and you've identified it. The Republican Party is basically nothing more than a party of grifters, a party of... And
because of that, you end up with everybody racing to the top to be in a Republican administration, and then the corruption shows up.
That's right.
Unreal.
Yeah, because corruption is their governing principle. Yeah, and by the way, there's a small portion of the Democratic Party that has thrown in with this as well. You find it more these days regionally, although there are still some Democrats who are basically in it for themselves and their buddies. But the Democratic Party has never embraced this as a governing principle, writ large. They flirted with it a lot during the Clinton administration, but they never embraced it.
Halliburton and Blackwater.
Yeah, it's all one thing. It's all one thing. Yeah, exactly right. Adam, thanks for the call. But you nailed it. Thanks for being with us today. What a day. What a day. I'm looking forward to seeing the clips from the congressional testimony today and seeing if Congress will ever get its courage and act together to impeach Attorney General Bill Barr. It really needs to be done. We'll be back tomorrow, same time, same place. In the meantime, don't forget, democracy is not a spectator sport. It requires you. Get out there, get active, tag you're it. And please, these are tough times. Be nice to the people around you. Be kind and considerate.
You've been listening to Thom Hartmann. For audio and video archives, visit thomhartmann.com.